In the depths of winter, when Moscow's ancient walls stood sentinel against the bitter winds of the 17th century, there stirred within the Kremlin's shadowed halls a force that would reshape the very soul of Russia. Not in the thunder of cannons or the clash of steel, but in the quiet breath of a newborn child did destiny announce itself. The year was 1672, and in that moment when snow fell like whispered prayers upon the golden domes of churches, Peter Alexeyevich drew his first breath, a breath that would one day blow across continents, carrying with it the dreams of a nation yearning to touch the edges of the world. Here, in the silence between one heartbeat and the next, between the old world and the new, begins a story that would echo through the corridors of time, where a boy would become a titan and Russia would awaken from its long medieval slumber. If this journey into history moves you, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Let timeless stories find new hearts, just like yours. On the 9th day of June in the year of our Lord 1672, as dawn painted the horizon with threads of gold and rose, the city of Moscow awakened to the sound of church bells ringing across the 7 hills. In the Terem Palace, within the fortress walls of the Kremlin, Tsar Alexis Mikhailovich paced the corridors like a man possessed by both hope and fear. His second wife, Natalia Kirillovna Narishkina, lay in the birthing chamber, and with each passing hour the weight of dynasty pressed heavier upon the sovereign's shoulders. The birth of Peter came not as a gentle arrival, but as a proclamation of life itself. The child's first cry rang through the palace halls with such vigour that the midwives whispered among themselves of omens and destiny. Here was no frail princeling, no delicate flower of nobility, but a robust infant whose very presence seemed to fill the chamber with an energy that bordered on the miraculous. Tsar Alexis, when he first held his son, felt in that tiny form a strength that spoke of futures yet unwritten. The Russia into which Peter was born existed at the crossroads of worlds, a vast realm stretching from the Arctic seas to the southern steppes, yet one that remained largely cut off from the currents of change that swept through Western Europe. It was a land where time moved differently, where ancient customs held sway over innovation, and where the Orthodox faith formed the bedrock of both spiritual and temporal authority. The Moscow of Peter's infancy was a city of contradictions, magnificent in its architectural grandeur, with the soaring spires of St. Basil's Cathedral and the golden cupolas of the Assumption Cathedral, yet provincial in its isolation from the great intellectual and cultural movements that had transformed much of Europe during the Renaissance. Peter's father, Tsar Alexis, was himself a figure caught between tradition and the whispered promises of modernization. Known as the quietest one for gentle nature, Alexis had already begun to sense that Russia could not forever remain an island unto itself. During his reign, the first tentative steps had been taken toward opening Russia to foreign influence. Western military techniques had been studied, foreign merchants had been granted limited privileges, and the Tsar had even allowed the establishment of the German quarter in Moscow, where foreigners could live according to their own customs. The child who would become Peter the Great was born into the complex web of court politics that defined Muscovite Russia. His mother, Natalia, came from the Narishkin family, which represented a more progressive faction at court, one that looked with curiosity rather than suspicion upon the ways of the West. Her own upbringing had been influenced by Ataman Matveyev, a boyar who had travelled beyond Russia's borders and had returned with ideas that challenged traditional Muscovite thinking. Through Matveyev's influence, Natalia had been exposed to concepts that were revolutionary for their time. The notion that women could be educated, that foreign knowledge might benefit Russia, and that change, rather than being feared, might be embraced as a pathway to greatness. In contrast to this progressive influence stood the older noble families, particularly the Miloslavskis, who were connected to Alexis through his first wife, Maria Miloslavskaya. These traditional boyars viewed any deviation from ancient custom with deep suspicion. They saw in the growing influence of foreign ideas a threat to the very foundations of Russian society, to the supremacy of Orthodox Christianity, and to their own positions of privilege within the established order. Into this complex political landscape, Peter was born as the 14th child of Tsar Alexis, but only the third son. His older half-brothers, Feodor and Ivan, children of the Tsar's first marriage, were both marked by frailty and illness. Feodor, the elder, possessed a sharp intellect, but suffered from a constitution so delicate that many doubted he would survive to adulthood. Ivan, younger but still Peter's senior, was afflicted with both physical and mental disabilities that made him an unlikely candidate for effective rule. In Peter, however, nature seemed to have concentrated all the vitality that had been dispersed among his siblings. From his earliest days, Peter displayed a physicality and energy that set him apart from the typical royal children of his time. While court protocol demanded that young princes be raised in the rarefied atmosphere of the palace, surrounded by tutors and attendants who would shield them from any contact with the rougher aspects of life, Peter seemed to rebel against such constraints even as an infant. His nurses reported that he was constantly in motion, that he slept poorly when confined to his cradle, and that he showed an unusual interest in objects and activities that lay beyond the normal sphere of aristocratic childhood. The baptism of Peter took place on the 29th of June, the feast day of Saints Peter and Paul, in the ancient Cathedral of the Assumption within the Kremlin walls. The ceremony itself was a magnificent affair, attended by the highest dignitaries of church and state, but those who were present later remembered not the splendour of the occasion, but the behaviour of the infant prince. Rather than remaining peacefully quiet during the sacred rituals, as royal children were expected to do, Peter seemed fascinated by everything around him. The flickering candles, the rich vestments of the clergy, the chanting of the choir, the golden iconostasis that soared toward the cathedral's vaulted ceiling. As Peter grew from infant to toddler, his unusual nature became even more apparent. While his half-brothers had been content to remain within the palace walls, absorbing the education deemed appropriate for princes, learning to read Church Slavonic, studying the lives of saints, and mastering the intricate protocols of court ceremony, Peter showed a marked preference for activities that took him beyond these confines. He was drawn to the palace workshops where craftsmen laboured over their trades, fascinated by the work of carpenters and blacksmiths, intrigued by the mechanisms of clocks and the construction of furniture. The traditional education provided to royal children in 17th century Russia was largely ecclesiastical in nature. Young princes were expected to master the Church Slavonic language, to study the Orthodox liturgy, to memorize vast portions of scripture, and to develop the pious demeanor that was considered essential to legitimate rule. While these subjects were not entirely neglected in Peter's education, his tutors quickly discovered that the young prince's interests lay in directions that were quite different from those of his predecessors. Peter's primary tutor was Nikita Zoltov, a man of modest background who had served as a clerk in various government offices before being elevated to the position of royal educator. Zoltov possessed neither the refined learning of a Western scholar nor the deep theological knowledge of a traditional Orthodox educator, but he had something perhaps more valuable, the ability to recognize and nurture Peter's unconventional interests. Rather than forcing the young prince to conform to established patterns of royal education, Zotov encouraged Peter's curiosity about practical matters and his fascination with how things worked. Under Zotov's guidance, Peter's education took on a distinctly hands-on character. Rather than simply reading about military matters in ancient texts, Peter was given toy soldiers and encouraged to stage mock battles. Instead of learning about geography from maps alone, he was taken to high towers within the Kremlin, from which he could observe the layout of Moscow and its surroundings. When Peter showed interest in mathematics, Zotov did not confine the lessons to abstract calculations, but taught him how mathematical principles applied to practical problems of construction and engineering. Perhaps most significantly, Zotov recognized that Peter's education would benefit from exposure to perspectives that lay beyond the traditional Russian worldview. This recognition led to what would prove to be one of the most important developments in Peter's early intellectual formation: his introduction to the foreign community that lived in the German quarter of Moscow. The tranquil years of Peter's early childhood came to an abrupt end on January 29th, 1676, when Tsar Alexis Mikhailovich breathed his last in the Winter Palace of the Kremlin. The death of the quietist Tsar sent ripples of uncertainty throughout the realm, for while succession in theory followed the principle of primogeniture, the reality of Russian court politics was far more complex. Peter, at barely 4 years of age, could hardly comprehend the magnitude of the changes that his father's death would bring to his life, but those changes would shape every aspect of his future development. The immediate succession fell to Feodor, Peter's half-brother and the eldest surviving son of Tsar Alexis. At 14, Feodor was old enough to assume the throne, but his chronic ill health cast a shadow over his reign from its very beginning. The young Tsar suffered from scurvy, a condition that left him weak and often bedridden, and many at court privately wondered whether he possessed the physical stamina necessary for effective rule over so vast an empire. With Feodor's accession to the throne, the balance of power at court shifted dramatically in favour of the Miloslavsky family, relatives of the new Tsar's mother. The Narishkins, Peter's maternal relatives who had enjoyed considerable influence during the later years of Alexis's reign, suddenly found themselves relegated to the margins of court life. This shift had profound implications for Peter's upbringing, as it meant that the progressive influences that had begun to shape his education were now viewed with suspicion by those who controlled the levers of power. Natalia Narishkina, Peter's mother, recognized the precarious nature of her position and that of her young son. In the Byzantine world of Muscovite court politics, changes in dynasty often meant not merely the loss of influence, but actual physical danger for those associated with the previous regime. Rather than attempting to maintain her position at court through political maneuvering, Natalia made the wise decision to withdraw from active participation in palace life, taking Peter with her to the village of Preobrazhenskoye, several miles from Moscow. This withdrawal from court, while politically prudent, had the unintended consequence of providing Peter with a childhood that was remarkably free from the constraints typically imposed upon royal children. Preobrazhenskoye was a summer residence of the Tsars, but it lacked the formal atmosphere and rigid protocol of the Kremlin. Here, Peter could roam freely, explore his surroundings, and pursue his interests without the constant supervision and ceremony that would have been his lot had he remained at the centre of court life. The village setting also brought Peter into contact with a wider range of people than he would have encountered in the palace. He interacted not only with nobles and courtiers, but with craftsmen, soldiers, and common folk whose perspectives on life differed markedly from those of the aristocratic elite. These encounters helped to shape Peter's understanding of Russia as something more than the narrow world of court politics. He began to see it as a vast realm inhabited by people of many different stations and backgrounds, all of whom had roles to play in the life of the nation. During these years of relative freedom, Peter's natural inclinations began to assert themselves more strongly. His fascination with military matters, which had first manifested in his play with toy soldiers, evolved into something approaching serious study. He organized groups of local children into mock military units, assigning them ranks, and drilling them in formations that he devised based on his observations of real soldiers. These games, which began as simple amusements, gradually took on a more sophisticated character as Peter's understanding of military principles deepened. The transformation of Peter's military games from child's play into something resembling actual military training was aided by the presence at Preobrazhenskoye of several foreign military experts who had been in the service of Tsar Alexis. These men, recognizing Peter's genuine interest and aptitude, began to provide him with instruction in the practical aspect of warfare. They taught him how to load and fire muskets, how to aim and operate small cannons, and how to construct the basic fortifications that were essential to 17th century military science. Peter's education in military matters was complemented by his growing fascination with mathematics and engineering. The practical applications of these subjects to military problems provided a bridge that connected his abstract learning with his concrete interests. He learned to calculate the trajectories of projectiles, to design defensive earthworks, and to solve the logistical problems involved in moving and supplying military units. These skills, acquired in what seemed like play, would later prove invaluable when he assumed command of actual armies. The relative freedom of life at Preobrazhenskoye also allowed Peter to pursue another interest that would have profound implications for his future, his fascination with navigation and seamanship. This interest was sparked by his discovery, in a storage shed on the estate, of an old English sailing boat that had belonged to his father. The boat had been abandoned and forgotten, but Peter's curiosity was immediately aroused by its unfamiliar design and construction. Peter's investigation of the English boat led him to seek out individuals who could explain its mysteries to him. He eventually found Franz Timmermann, a Dutch merchant living in the German quarter of Moscow, who possessed knowledge of navigation and shipbuilding. Under Timmermann's tutelage, Peter learned the basic principles of sailing and began to understand how vessels could be designed to harness the power of the wind for transportation and exploration. The discovery of the boat and his subsequent education in nautical matters opened Peter's mind to possibilities that extended far beyond the terrestrial concerns that had traditionally occupied Russian rulers. He began to dream of Russia as a maritime power, of fleets that could project Russian influence across distant seas, and of trade routes that could bring the wealth of foreign lands to his homeland. These dreams, nurtured during his childhood at Preobrazhenskoye, would later drive many of the most ambitious projects of his reign. While Peter was developing his interests and abilities in this relatively free environment, the political situation in Moscow was becoming increasingly unstable. Tsar Feodor's health continued to deteriorate, and it became clear that his reign would be brief. The question of succession, which had seemed settled with Feodor's accession, was once again thrown into uncertainty. Feodor had no children, and the choice of his successor would depend upon the relative strength of the competing factions at court. The Miloslavsky faction favoured Ivan, Peter's other half-brother, despite his obvious disabilities. Ivan's supporters argued that primogeniture demanded his elevation to the throne, regardless of his personal limitations. The Naryshkin faction, while less powerful, continued to support Peter's claims, pointing to his obvious health and intelligence as qualifications that outweighed the strict application of age-based succession rules. As Feodor's condition worsened throughout 1681 and into 1682, these factional tensions became increasingly acute. Both sides began to prepare for the struggle that would inevitably follow the Tsar's death, gathering supporters and making plans for the dramatic events that lay ahead. Peter, now 10 years old, was gradually made aware of these political currents, though he could not yet fully comprehend the extent to which his own future hung in the balance. The death of Tsar Feodor III on April 27, 1682, marked the beginning of one of the most turbulent periods in Russian history, a time when the very foundations of Muscovite political order would be tested by competing claims to power and the violent passions they unleashed. Peter, at 10 years of age, found himself thrust into the centre of a dynastic crisis that would determine not only his own fate, but the future direction of the Russian Empire. Feodor's death had been anticipated for months, but when it finally came, it caught many of the major players in Muscovite politics unprepared for the intensity of the struggle that would follow. The traditional mechanism for royal succession, the automatic elevation of the eldest surviving male heir, was complicated by the fact that Ivan, though older than Peter, was widely regarded as unfit to rule due to his physical and mental disabilities. This created an unprecedented situation in which the normal rules of succession would have to be set aside in favour of a more practical consideration of the candidate's actual qualifications for rulership. The immediate aftermath of Fyodor's death saw frantic manoeuvring by the various court factions. The Miloslavsky party, led by Ivan's sister Sophia, argued forcefully that the principle of primogeniture must be respected regardless of personal circumstances. They portrayed any attempt to bypass Ivan in favour of Peter as a dangerous precedent that would undermine the entire basis of legitimate authority in Russia. The Naryshkin faction, while agreeing that Ivan's claim had legal merit, countered that the practical requirements of governing so vast and complex an empire demanded a ruler who possessed not only legitimacy, but also the physical and intellectual capacity for effective leadership. The decision was ultimately referred to an assembly of boyars, clergy, and other dignitaries who gathered in the Kremlin to deliberate on the succession. This assembly, while not possessing formal constitutional authority, represented the closest approximation to popular consultation that existed within the Muscovite political system. After extensive debate, the assembly declared in favour of Peter, recognizing in the young prince the qualities that they believed Russia needed in its future sovereign. The announcement of Peter's elevation to the throne was greeted with what seemed to be general approval from the assembled dignitaries and the crowds that had gathered in Red Square to await news of the succession. For a brief moment, it appeared that the transition of power would proceed smoothly, without the violence and chaos that had marked so many dynastic changes in Russian history. This appearance of stability, however, proved to be deceptive, as forces were already in motion that would soon plunge Moscow into one of the bloodiest episodes of the 17th century. The key to understanding the events that followed lies in the role of the Streltsy, the elite military units that served as both the royal guard and the primary instrument of internal security in Muscovite Russia. These troops, originally created by Ivan the Terrible in the 16th century, had evolved into a powerful corporate body with interests and loyalties that did not always align with those of the ruling dynasty. The Streltsy possessed not only military strength, but also significant economic privileges, including the right to engage in trade and manufacturing activities that supplemented their military pay. The supporters of Ivan and Sofia, recognizing that they lacked the political strength to overturn the Boyar Assembly's decision through normal means, turned to the Streltsy as potential allies in their cause. They began to spread rumours among the troops that Peter's supporters had not only usurped the throne illegally, but had also murdered Ivan to eliminate him as a rival claimant. These allegations, though completely false, found fertile ground among Streltsy, who had their own grievances against the current regime, and who saw in the dynastic crisis an opportunity to advance their corporate interests. The explosion came on May 15, 1682, when armed units of Streltsy marched on the Kremlin demanding to see both Peter and Ivan to verify that the latter had not been murdered. What began as a demand for reassurance quickly escalated into a full-scale revolt, as the troops, inflamed by rumours and encouraged by Sofia's supporters, turned their weapons against those they perceived as enemies. The violence that followed was unprecedented in its brutality, as the Streltsy systematically hunted down and killed members of the Narishkin faction and others associated with Peter's cause. Among the victims of the Streltsy rampage was Artemon Matveyev, the boyar who had been instrumental in shaping the progressive influences that had marked Peter's early education. Matveyev's death was particularly brutal. He was thrown from a window of the palace and then hacked to pieces by the soldiers below. This murder was not merely an act of political violence, but a symbolic assault on the modernizing tendencies that Matveyev had represented. With his death, one of the key links between Peter and the broader world of European ideas was severed. The trauma of witnessing such violence left an indelible mark on Peter's developing psyche. Years later, he would recall the horror of seeing trusted advisors and family friends murdered before his eyes, their blood staining the ancient stones of the Kremlin courtyards. The experience instilled in him a deep distrust of the traditional military establishments that had enabled such carnage, and it reinforced his conviction that Russia's future lay not in the preservation of old institutions, but in their complete transformation. The immediate political consequence of the Streltsy revolt was the compromise solution that elevated both Peter and Ivan to the throne as co-tsars, with Sofia serving as regent due to Ivan's disabilities and Peter's youth. This arrangement, unprecedented in Russian history, reflected the balance of forces that emerged from the crisis rather than any coherent theory of governance. The famous double throne, specially constructed for the coronation ceremony, became a symbol of the divided authority that would characterize Russian government for the next 7 years. For Peter, the establishment of the regency meant a return to political marginalization, but it also provided him with the opportunity to continue his unconventional education away from the scrutiny of court politics. Sofia, secure in her power and confident that she could maintain control over both the government and the military, was content to allow Peter to pursue his interest at Preobrazhenskoye, seeing no immediate threat in the activities of a boy who seemed more interested in toy soldiers and sailing boats than in the serious business of statecraft. This miscalculation on Sofia's part would prove to be one of the most consequential errors in Russian political history. While she focused her attention on the formal mechanisms of power, the bureaucracy, the court, the traditional military units, Peter was quietly developing capabilities and relationships that would eventually enable him to challenge her authority. The years of the regency, rather than marginalizing Peter permanently, provided him with the freedom to grow and learn in ways that would have been impossible had he remained at the center of court life. The psychological impact of the Streltsy revolt extended far beyond its immediate political consequences. the experience of witnessing such violence and chaos at close range convinced Peter that the traditional institutions of Muscovite Russia were fundamentally flawed, and that genuine reform would require not gradual modification, but revolutionary change. The revolt also demonstrated to him the dangers of relying on military units whose loyalty was based on corporate self-interest, rather than personal dedication to the sovereign. These lessons would profoundly influence Peter's later reforms, particularly his creation of new military institutions based on Western European models, and his deliberate weakening of the traditional boyar and Streltsy establishments that had enabled the violence of 1682. The traumatic events of his childhood thus served as both a warning and an inspiration, showing him what needed to be avoided while simultaneously demonstrating the necessity for fundamental change. In the aftermath of the Streltsy revolt and the establishment of Sophia's regency, Peter found himself in a position that was simultaneously marginal and liberating. Cast out from the centres of formal power, but freed from the constraints of traditional court life, he was able to pursue an education that was unlike anything experienced by previous Russian rulers. The years from 1682 to 1689, during which Sophia governed Russia as regent, became for Peter a time of intensive learning and personal development that would shape every aspect of his later reign. The retreat to Preobrazhenskoye, which had begun as a temporary withdrawal from court politics, now became a permanent arrangement that suited both Peter's interests and Sophia's political calculations. For Peter, the rural estate provided an environment in which he could explore his fascinations with military science, technology, and foreign ideas without the interference of traditional court protocol. For Sophia, Peter's absence from Moscow eliminated a potential source of political opposition, while allowing her to consolidate her control over the machinery of government. Peter's education during these years was supervised by his mother, Natalia, but the actual instruction came from a diverse group of tutors and advisors who represented perspectives that were rare in traditional Russian society. Nikita Zotov continued to serve as Peter's primary tutor, but his role evolved from that of a conventional educator to something more akin to a facilitator who helped Peter pursue his own interests, rather than imposing a predetermined curriculum upon him. This educational philosophy, revolutionary for its time, recognized that Peter's unconventional interests and learning style required approaches that differed markedly from traditional Russian pedagogical methods. Rather than emphasizing rote memorization of religious texts and court ceremonial, Peter's education focused on practical skills and empirical observation. He learned mathematics not as an abstract discipline, but as a tool for solving engineering problems. He studied history not merely as a chronicle of past events, but as a source of lessons for contemporary statecraft. The most significant aspect of Peter's unconventional education was his exposure to foreign ideas and perspectives through his contact with the residents of the German quarter in Moscow. This community, established during the reign of his father, consisted of foreign merchants, craftsmen, military experts, and diplomats who had come to Russia to pursue various opportunities. While they were required to live separately from the Russian population, they maintained their own customs, practiced their own religions, and brought with them knowledge and skills that were largely unknown in traditional Russian society. Peter's fascination with the German quarter began during his childhood explorations, but intensified during his teenage years as he became more aware of the contrast between Russian and European approaches to technology, military organization, and economic development. His regular visits to the quarter, initially discouraged by his tutors as inappropriate for a member of the royal family, eventually became an accepted part of his education, as their value became apparent. Among the foreign residents who influenced Peter's development, none was more important than Frans Timmerman, the Dutch merchant who had introduced him to the principles of navigation and shipbuilding. Timmerman possessed not only technical knowledge, but also a broader understanding of how maritime commerce and naval power contributed to the strength and prosperity of European nations. Under his guidance, Peter began to envision Russia not as a purely continental power, but as a potential maritime empire capable of projecting its influence across distant seas. This vision was reinforced and expanded through Peter's relationship with other foreign experts, particularly those with military backgrounds. General Patrick Gordon, a Scottish officer who had entered Russian service during the reign of Tsar Alexis, became one of Peter's most important mentors in military affairs. Gordon brought to Peter's education not only knowledge of European military techniques, but also an understanding of how military power related to broader questions of statecraft and international relations. Under Gordon's influence, Peter's childhood fascination with toy soldiers evolved into serious study of military science. He learned about different types of military units and their tactical employment, about the logistics of supplying armies in the field, and about the relationship between military technology and battlefield effectiveness. More importantly, he began to understand how military power served as both an instrument of foreign policy and a means of internal control. The practical application of Peter's military education took the form of increasingly sophisticated war games, conducted with groups of young men who'd been recruited from various social backgrounds to serve as his companions and subordinates. These exercises, which began as simple drills with toy weapons, gradually evolved into elaborate maneuvers involving hundreds of participants and the use of actual military equipment. The two regiments that emerged from these activities, the Preobrazhensky and Semyonovsky Guards, would later become the foundation of Peter's reformed Russian army. The transformation of Peter's military games from amateur theatrics into serious training exercises was facilitated by the availability of experienced foreign officers who were willing to serve as instructors. These men, many of whom had served in the armies of Western European powers, brought with them knowledge of the latest military innovations and tactical developments. They taught Peter and his companions about the use of firearms, the construction of fortifications, the principles of artillery employment, and the coordination of different types of military units in combined operations. Peter's education in military affairs was complemented by his growing interest in technology and engineering. He spent countless hours in workshops learning the crafts of carpentry, metalworking, and mechanical construction. These activities, which might have seemed beneath the dignity of a royal prince, were actually providing him with practical skills that would prove invaluable in his later efforts to modernize Russia. His understanding of how things were made gave him insights into manufacturing processes that would inform his later industrial policies. The breadth of Peter's interest during these formative years was remarkable. In addition to military science and technology, he pursued studies in mathematics, geography, astronomy, and natural philosophy. His approach to learning was always practical rather than theoretical. He wanted to understand not just abstract principles, but how they could be applied to solve real problems. This practical orientation would later characterize his approach to governing, as he consistently sought reforms that would produce tangible improvements in Russia's capabilities and performance. Perhaps most importantly, Peter's unconventional education instilled in him a deep skepticism about traditional authorities and established ways of doing things. His exposure to foreign ideas and methods showed him that there were alternative approaches to problems that Russians had long considered intractable. He learned that change was not only possible but necessary if Russia was to compete effectively with other European powers. This lesson, absorbed during his teenage years, would drive his later reform efforts and explain his willingness to overturn institutions and practices that had endured for centuries. The years of Peter's unconventional education also saw the development of his personal relationships with individuals who would later play crucial roles in his government. Many of the young men who participated in his military exercises at Preobrazhenskoye would eventually become officers in his reformed army and administrators in his modernized bureaucracy. The foreign experts who served as his tutors would become trusted advisors whose counsel would influence major policy decisions. The network of relationships that Peter built during these formative years provided him with a cadre of loyal and capable subordinates when he finally came to power. As the 1680s progressed and Peter approached adulthood, it became increasingly clear that his unconventional education had produced a prince unlike any who had previously sat on the Russian throne. He possessed not only theoretical knowledge but practical skills, not only familiarity with Russian traditions but appreciation for foreign innovations, not only royal authority but personal relationships with individuals from many different social backgrounds. These qualities, developed during years of apparent political marginalization, would soon make him one of the most formidable rulers in Russian history. The stage was thus set for the dramatic confrontation that would end Sophia's regency and launch Peter's transformation of Russia. The young man who had spent 7 years learning unconventional lessons in an unconventional manner was about to discover whether his unique education had prepared him for the supreme test of political leadership. The quiet years at Preobrazhenskoye were drawing to a close, and the thunderous decades of Peter the Great were about to begin. While Moscow's gilded halls echoed with whispered prayers and ancient rituals, far from the suffocating embrace of court tradition, a young prince discovered freedom in the countryside air of Preobrazhenskoye. Here, where morning mist clung to meadows and the scent of pine mixed with fertile earth, Peter Alexeyevich grew not into the carefully moulded successor that palace tutors had envisioned, but into something entirely his own, a force of nature wrapped in royal blood, hungry for knowledge that no dusty throne room could contain. The village of Preobrazhenskoye sprawled beneath wide Russian skies, its wooden houses and winding paths offering a stark contrast to the marble coldness of the Kremlin. Here, with his mother Natalia watching from latticed windows, Peter learned the language of hammer and nail, the patience of the craftsman's trade, the satisfying weight of tools shaped by human hands. While other princes memorized court etiquette and the intricate dance of Byzantine ceremony, Peter's fingers grew calloused from carpentry, his shoulders broad from lifting timber, his mind sharp from solving the practical puzzles that physical work presented. His tutor, Nikita Zotov, was no learned scholar draped in ecclesiastical robes, but a simple church clerk whose greatest gift lay not in Latin conjugations, but in his ability to kindle wonder. Through Zotov's patient voice, the chronicles of Russia's past came alive, not as dry recitations of dates and dynasties, but as living stories of courage and conquest, of princes who had carved kingdoms from wilderness, and czars who had stood against the golden tide of Mongol invasion. Peter listened with the intensity of a hunter tracking prey, absorbing these tales not as historical curiosities, but as blueprints for the future he would build. But it was the world beyond words that truly captured the young prince's imagination. In workshops scattered throughout Preobrazhenskoye, foreign craftsmen, Germans, Dutch and English artisans who had found refuge in this distant corner of the Russian Empire, bent over their trades with practiced skill. Peter watched their hands shape metal into precision instruments, observed how they measured twice and cut once, learned that mastery came not from noble birth, but from patient application of mind to matter. These men, exiles from their own lands, became Peter's truest teachers, showing him that knowledge flowed not from ancient texts, but from the marriage of thought and action. The German Quarter, or Nemetskaya Sloboda, became Peter's second home, a place where curiosity was rewarded rather than stifled, where questions led to experiments rather than scripture. Among these foreign residents, Peter discovered Franz Timmerman, a Dutch merchant whose mathematical mind opened doorways to sciences that Russian noble education had never contemplated. Under Timmerman's guidance, Peter learned to see the world through the lens of geometry, to understand that fortification was not merely about high walls, but about angles and sight lines, that navigation required not just courage, but calculation. When Prince Yakov Dolgoruki returned from his diplomatic mission to Paris carrying an astrolabe, that mysterious instrument capable of measuring distances without moving, Peter's excitement was palpable. But like a riddle wrapped in brass and calibrated steel, the device remained silent until Timmerman revealed its secrets. Those first lessons in practical mathematics became Peter's gateway to understanding that the world operated according to laws more precise than any royal decree, that mastery over nature required tools more sophisticated than sword and scepter. Yet it was discovery of a different sort that would prove most transformative. On a summer day in 1688, when the air hung heavy with the promise of rain, and dragonflies danced over the estate pond at Ismailovo, Peter and Timmerman found themselves exploring the forgotten corners of an old storehouse. Dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight that streamed through broken boards, illuminating treasures left behind by previous generations. There, among bolts of faded silk and tarnished silver, lay a boat unlike any Peter had ever seen. This was no river barge built for calm waters, no fishing vessel designed for sheltered lakes, but something altogether more ambitious. An English boat constructed for the open sea, built to harness not just current but wind itself. Timmerman's explanation that this craft could sail even against the wind struck Peter like revelation. Here was mastery over the elements themselves, technology that could transform human will into motion regardless of nature's whims. The restoration of that weathered boat became Peter's obsession. Under the skilled hands of Carsten Brandt, another Dutch craftsman, the vessel slowly returned to seaworthiness. Peter watched every repair, absorbed every technique, learned how wind and water could be partners rather than obstacles. His first tentative voyages on the boat became journeys of discovery, not just of sailing technique, but of possibility itself. Soon, the confines of small ponds and protected harbours proved insufficient for Peter's growing ambitions. Lake Pleshcheyevo, with its broad expanse of open water, became his maritime academy. Here, far from the disapproving eyes of court officials who viewed such common pursuits as beneath royal dignity, Peter established his first shipbuilding operation. The sound of hammer on wood, the smell of tar and rope, the sight of craft taking shape under calloused hands, these became the sensory memories that would define his reign more than any coronation ceremony. The fleet that grew on Lake Pleshcheyevo's shores was modest by later standards, but each vessel represented a triumph of will over convention. Peter didn't merely commission these boats, he built them with his own hands, learned every joint and sail, understood each rope's purpose and each timber's strength. This was education of the most practical sort, preparation for challenges he could sense approaching like distant thunder. What began as childhood games gradually transformed into something far more significant, a revolution in military thinking disguised as royal recreation. Peter's play troops, initially recruited from young servants and willing companions, evolved into the foundation of Russia's first modern army. These weren't the elaborate court pageants that had satisfied previous generations of princes, but serious exercises in military science, conducted with an intensity that bordered on the obsessive. The Preobrazhensky Regiment, named for the village where it first mustered, became Peter's laboratory for testing new ideas about warfare. These young men, drawn from various social backgrounds united by shared enthusiasm for military innovation, drilled with real weapons, practiced actual formations, and studied the science of fortification with academic rigour. Peter himself served not as commanding prince, but as ordinary bombardier, learning from the ground up how artillery functioned, how supplies moved, how soldiers thought and fought. The Semyonovsky Regiment followed, expanding Peter's military academy beyond what any single unit could contain. Together, these formations represented something entirely new in Russian military culture. Forces trained not in the ceremonial traditions of the Streltsy, but according to Western European standards of discipline and technique. Peter's innovations were revolutionary not just in their methods but in their implications. Here was a prince who believed that effectiveness mattered more than tradition, that merit should determine advancement rather than birth. Mock battles between these regiments became elaborate affairs, conducted with increasing sophistication as Peter's knowledge grew. Earthworks were constructed according to the latest principles of military engineering. Siege tactics were practiced using full-scale fortifications. Artillery exercises featured real cannon, their thunderous reports echoing across the countryside like previews of conflict yet to come. Foreign observers, initially dismissive of what they assumed were childish diversions, gradually recognized that they were witnessing the birth of a new kind of military force. Peter's model fortress, built for his amusement but constructed according to rigorous engineering principles, became a teaching tool of remarkable sophistication. Every bastion has been positioned to maximize defensive fire, every gate designed to channel attackers into killing zones, every wall angled to deflect cannon shot. This wasn't mere play, but practical education in the art of war, preparation for the day when such knowledge would prove essential for Russia's survival. The young prince's immersion in military culture extended beyond tactics and technology to embrace the psychology of command. He lived among his soldiers, shared their hardships, understood their motivations. This intimate knowledge of military life would later enable him to inspire loyalty in ways that mere royal authority could never achieve. His men followed him not from duty alone but from genuine respect for his competence and commitment. Within these military exercises, Peter also experimented with social innovations that would eventually transform Russian society. Merit, not birth, determined promotion within his regiments. Competence, not connections, earned advancement. Foreign techniques were welcomed rather than rejected, creating an atmosphere of openness to innovation that stood in stark contrast to the xenophobic conservatism that characterized much of Russian noble culture. These military games also served as diplomatic tools, attracting the attention of foreign experts who recognized Peter's serious intentions. General Patrick Gordon, the Scottish soldier of fortune who had become one of Peter's most trusted advisors, first encountered the young prince during these elaborate exercises. Gordon's professional assessment was immediate and positive. Here was a ruler who understood that modern warfare required more than courage and numbers, who grasped that victory belonged to those who best combined technology, training, and tactical innovation. Similarly, Francis Lefort, the Swiss adventurer whose cosmopolitan experience would prove invaluable in Peter's later diplomatic initiatives, first gained the prince's attention through his contributions to these military academies. Lefort brought not just technical expertise but cultural sophistication, introducing Peter to European customs and ideas that would eventually reshape Russian court life. Through these extended military exercises, Peter also developed his famous capacity for physical endurance and hands-on leadership. He could march with common soldiers, work alongside craftsmen, endure hardships that would have broken nobles raised in luxury. This physical toughness, combined with intellectual curiosity and administrative competence, created a leadership style uniquely suited to the challenges Russia would face in the coming decades. The call from Moscow arrived like winter wind, cutting through the warm camaraderie of military exercises and shipbuilding projects with the cold edge of political necessity. Natalia Narishkina had decided that her son, now approaching manhood at 17, required the stabilizing influence of marriage. The choice of bride reflected not romantic consideration, but careful political calculation. Eudoxia Lopukhina, daughter of a respected boyar family, embodied the conservative virtues that might balance Peter's increasingly radical enthusiasms. The wedding ceremony on January 27, 1689, unfolded with all the elaborate ritual that Russian tradition demanded. Golden icons watched from walls draped in precious silks as Metropolitan Joachim pronounced the ancient words that bound Peter to a life he had never chosen. Eudoxia, 3 years his senior, carried herself with the dignified reserve expected of a Tsar's bride. But beneath the ceremonial splendour lay a fundamental mismatch that both participants sensed, but neither could acknowledge. Where Peter radiated restless energy and insatiable curiosity, Eudoxia embodied careful propriety and religious devotion. While he spoke enthusiastically of ships and fortifications, foreign techniques and military innovations, she found comfort in prayer books and traditional observances. Their conversations, when they occurred, revealed the vast gulf between Peter's expansive vision and her narrow but deeply rooted concerns. She saw in his foreign friendships a dangerous departure from Russian custom. He found in her conservative outlook a constraint upon his ambitions. Yet duty demanded at least the appearance of marital cooperation, and 3 sons resulted from their union. Alexis in 1690, followed by Alexander and Paul, though only Alexis would survive to adulthood. These children represented both continuation of the dynasty and embodiment of the tensions within it. Alexis especially would inherit not just his father's throne but the fundamental contradiction between traditional Russian values and Peter's revolutionary vision. But Peter's heart, denied fulfillment in marriage, found solace elsewhere. Through Francis Lefort's introduction, he met Anna Montz, a German woman whose intelligence and sophistication offered everything his marriage lacked. Anna understood Peter's fascination with foreign culture, shared his enthusiasm for innovation, provided the intellectual companionship that Eudoxia could not offer. Their relationship, lasting more than a decade, represented not mere romantic indulgence, but spiritual partnership with someone who comprehended his deepest aspirations. The contrast between his public marriage and private affection reflected broader tensions within Peter's emerging identity. Official ceremonies bound him to traditional expectations, but personal relationships revealed his true inclinations toward cosmopolitan culture. This duality would characterize his entire reign. the necessity of working within existing structures while gradually transforming them according to his vision. Peter's reluctant return to Moscow after his brief honeymoon revealed another dimension of this tension. The capital's atmosphere of suspicion and intrigue felt suffocating after the open camaraderie of Preobrazhenskoye. Court officials viewed his foreign associations with growing alarm, while conservative nobles whispered about the dangerous precedent of a Tsar who preferred commoners' company to noble society. Peter sensed their disapproval but remained committed to his chosen path. The Jolly Company, as Peter's diverse circle of companions became known, represented a deliberate challenge to traditional social hierarchies. This group included not just Russian nobles but foreign experts, common soldiers who had distinguished themselves in service, craftsmen whose skills Peter valued, and adventurers whose experiences offered windows into the wider world. Their gatherings, marked by informal discussion and practical problem-solving rather than ceremonial protocol, provided Peter with the intellectual stimulation that formal court life could never offer. These companions shared more than social fellowship. They formed the nucleus of Peter's eventual government, the trusted advisors who would help implement his revolutionary programs. Patrick Gordon brought military expertise honed in European campaigns. Francis Lefort contributed diplomatic sophistication and cultural knowledge. Others offered specialized skills in shipbuilding, engineering, administration, and trade. Together they constituted an informal cabinet of experts whose competence mattered more than their birth. Through these relationships, Peter also gained exposure to ideas that would eventually transform Russian society. Western European concepts of individual merit, scientific inquiry, technological innovation, and administrative efficiency filtered through these personal connections to shape his emerging worldview. What began as personal friendships gradually evolved into philosophical commitments that would guide his reign. The lavish banquets hosted by the Jolly Company became laboratories for social experimentation. Here, Peter tested new forms of court culture that emphasized substance over ceremony, achievement over ancestry. Foreign customs were introduced alongside traditional Russian hospitality, creating hybrid cultural forms that would eventually spread throughout educated society. These gatherings served not merely as entertainment, but as training grounds for the new elite that Peter intended to create. The drums of war that had long echoed from distant frontiers finally reached Peter's eager ears in 1695, bringing with them the opportunity he had dreamed of since childhood, the chance to transform military theory into battlefield reality. Russia's ongoing commitment to the Holy League against Ottoman Turkey provided the pretext, but Peter's motivations ran deeper than diplomatic obligation. Here was the test that would prove whether his revolutionary military reforms could succeed where traditional Russian forces had failed. The fortress of Azov, perched on the Don River's mouth like a stone sentinel guarding the approaches to the Black Sea, represented more than a military objective. Its capture would provide Russia with its first warm water port, opening maritime routes that had been closed since the Mongol invasions. More importantly for Peter, the campaign offered a laboratory for testing the new regiments he had so carefully trained. The artillery techniques he had studied, the engineering principles he had absorbed through years of practical education. As spring arrived in 1695, Peter's forces moved southward with equipment and organization that marked a clear departure from traditional Russian military practice. The Preobrazhensky and Semyonovsky regiments marched with uniforms and weapons modelled on Western European standards. Artillery trains carried cannon manufactured according to the latest technical specifications. Supply wagons bore provisions calculated to sustain extended siege operations. Every detail reflected Peter's determination to conduct warfare according to scientific principles rather than heroic improvisation. Yet the approach to Azov revealed the vast difference between theoretical knowledge and practical application. The fortress, strengthened by generations of Turkish engineers and defended by experienced soldiers, presented challenges that no amount of training could fully anticipate. Its walls rose from marshy ground that complicated siege approaches, while the Don River provided defenders with secure supply lines that besiegers could not easily cut. Turkish artillery, positioned to command all approaches, demonstrated that Russia's enemies had also mastered the military sciences. The first assaults, in August 1695, met with devastating failure. Russian troops, despite their improved training and equipment, discovered that courage alone could not overcome well-prepared defences. Artillery duels that had seemed manageable in exercises proved murderous when conducted against professional soldiers fighting for their lives. The carefully planned siege approaches became killing grounds, where Russian blood soaked into foreign soil without achieving meaningful progress. Worse than tactical failure was the revelation of command dysfunction that plagued Peter's forces. Traditional Russian military culture, with its emphasis on noble privilege and ceremonial rank, clashed destructively with the meritocratic principles that Peter had tried to introduce. Experienced generals, resentful of foreign innovations, undermined plans they considered beneath their dignity. Noble officers, accustomed to leading through birth rather than competence, proved inadequate to the technical demands of modern warfare. The division among commanders became as dangerous as enemy fire. Some advocated continued assault despite mounting casualties, while others urged withdrawal to preserve forces for future campaigns. Peter, still learning the harsh lessons of leadership under fire, found himself caught between competing military philosophies and conflicting personal loyalties. The young Tsar, who had seemed so confident in his training grounds, discovered that real warfare demanded political as well as military skills. As autumn approached and the siege stalled, Peter made the difficult decision to withdraw. The retreat northward represented not just tactical defeat but profound personal humiliation. The prince who had dreamed of military glory found himself explaining failure to a court that had never believed in his innovations. Conservative nobles, vindicated in their skepticism about foreign methods, resumed their whispered campaigns against Peter's radical enthusiasms. But defeat also brought revelation. During the long winter months following the Azov failure, Peter analysed what had gone wrong with the methodical precision he had learned from foreign teachers. The siege had failed not because his innovations were wrong, but because they had been incompletely implemented. Russian forces lacked naval support, enabling Turkish supplies to reach the fortress by sea. Command structure remained contaminated by traditional prejudices that undermined tactical effectiveness. Artillery, while improved, still fell short of European standards in both quality and quantity. Most importantly, Peter recognized that military reform required broader social transformation. Modern warfare demanded not just better weapons but new forms of organization, not just tactical innovation but cultural change. The officer corps needed reconstruction from the ground up, replacing privilege with competence as the basis for advancement. The supply system required complete overhaul to support extended campaigns. The entire relationship between army and society needed redefinition to sustain the sacrifices that modern warfare demanded. These insights would guide Peter's preparations for the second Azov campaign. but they also foreshadowed the comprehensive transformation of Russian society that would define his reign. Military necessity would drive domestic reform, while domestic reform would enable military success. The failed siege of 1695 thus became not just Peter's first defeat, but his first lesson in the interconnected nature of political and military power. Winter's grip upon Moscow in early 1696 carried more than seasonal cold. It brought with it the final breath of the old order that had shaped Peter's early years. Ivan V, the gentle half-brother who had shared the throne in name while Peter wielded power in fact, succumbed to illness on January 29th, ending the peculiar dual monarchy that had emerged from the Streltsy crisis 14 years earlier. With Ivan's death, Peter stood alone as Russia's sole ruler, free at last from even the symbolic constraints that joint rule had imposed. The transition from co-Tsar to autocrat brought both liberation and weight. No longer need Peter consult another's opinion, however nominal, when making decisions that affected the empire's future. No longer could opponents appeal to alternative authority when challenging his innovations. The throne that had seemed almost accidental in his youth now sat firmly beneath him, its power undiluted by shared responsibility or competing claims. Yet this moment of supreme authority coincided with pressing demands for its exercise. The humiliation at Azov still burned in Peter's memory, a wound that demanded healing through successful action. The second campaign, planned throughout the winter months with meticulous attention to the lessons learned from failure, would test not just Peter's military theories, but his capacity to translate absolute power into effective action. The shipbuilding operation at Voronezh, begun even before Ivan's death, represented Peter's response to the naval weaknesses that had doomed the first siege. Working alongside common labourers, the Tsar learned every aspect of ship construction, from selecting timber to rigging sails. These vessels, crude by later standards but revolutionary for Russia, embodied Peter's determination to master the technologies that modern warfare required. More than 40 ships would accompany the second Azov expedition, carrying nearly double the previous force and equipped according to lessons purchased with Russian blood. But numbers alone could not ensure success. The army that marched south in 1696 also reflected fundamental changes in organisation and command. Peter had used his winter preparations to purge incompetent officers, promote capable subordinates regardless of birth, and establish clear chains of command that eliminated the confusion that had plagued the earlier campaign. The siege that began in summer 1696 proceeded with methodical precision that demonstrated how much Peter had learned from previous failure. Artillery emplacements were positioned according to mathematical calculation rather than traditional practice. Siege approaches followed lines dictated by engineering science rather than heroic custom. Supply lines operated with efficiency that reflected careful logistical planning rather than improvised solutions. Most crucially, the Russian fleet now commanded the Don River's mouth, severing the supply lines that had sustained Turkish defenders during the earlier siege. Ships that Peter had helped build with his own hands now carried the cannon that battered Azov's walls, while Russian sailors who had learned their trade under his direct supervision manoeuvred to prevent enemy reinforcement. The integration of land and naval forces represented a sophistication that few European armies could match. When Turkish resistance finally collapsed in July 1696, the victory represented more than territorial gain. Azov's capture validated Peter's approach to military reform, demonstrated the effectiveness of his Western-influenced innovations, and established his reputation as a commander capable of learning from defeat. The fortress that had seemed impregnable became Russia's first foothold on the path to naval power. The establishment of Taganrog on the northern shore of the Don estuary immediately followed Azov's capture, representing Peter's determination to consolidate territorial gains through permanent settlement. But more ambitious still was the decision to construct a full naval arsenal, capable of building ships for Black Sea operations. This wasn't merely a port, but the foundation of Russian naval power, the beginning of a fleet that would eventually challenge Ottoman dominance in southern waters. Yet even as Peter celebrated military success, his mind was already ranging beyond the Black Sea toward broader horizons. The techniques that had proven effective against Ottoman fortification could serve equally well against Swedish strongholds in the Baltic. The organizational methods that had coordinated the Azov siege could manage even larger operations against more sophisticated enemies. The diplomatic alliances that might contain Turkish power could perhaps isolate Sweden as well. The victory at Azov thus marked not just the end of Peter's military apprenticeship, but the beginning of his emergence as a European power. The young Tsar, who had once played with toy soldiers, now commanded real armies capable of achieving real objectives. The prince who'd learned shipbuilding as a hobby now possessed fleets that could project Russian power beyond traditional borders. The student of foreign military science had become its master, ready to apply his education to challenges that would reshape the continental balance of power. As autumn approached and Russian forces settled into winter quarters, Peter's thoughts turned toward the wider world beyond Russia's frontiers. The grand embassy that he would launch the following year had been conceived before Azov's capture, but victory had transformed its character from desperate search for allies into confident exploration of opportunities. Russia now approached Europe not as a supplicant, but as a power worthy of respect, ready to claim its place among the nations that would shape the new century's course. The transformation from co-ruler to autocrat had been completed not just through Ivan's death, but through Peter's demonstration of competent leadership under pressure. The throne he now occupied alone rested upon foundations stronger than hereditary right or popular acclaim. It stood supported by proven ability to translate vision into reality, to learn from failure, and to succeed where success mattered most. The boy who had once hidden from the Streltsy's rage had become a man capable of commanding their successors, ready to lead Russia toward a future that few could yet imagine, but that he was already beginning to create. The young Tsar's eyes had been opened to possibilities that stretched far beyond the borders of his vast realm. As Peter stood in his workshop at Preobrazhenskoye in the winter of 1696, surrounded by the tools of his trade and the plans for ships that existed only in his imagination, he felt the pull of distant shores calling to him across the frozen landscape of Russia. The victories at Azov had proven that Russia could triumph against her enemies, but they had also revealed how much more there was to learn. In the flickering candlelight of those winter evenings, as snow fell silently beyond the windows and the fires crackled in their hearths, Peter would spread maps across wooden tables and trace with his finger the routes that led westward to the great capitals of Europe. Franz Lefort, his Swiss companion and trusted adviser, would sit beside him, speaking in measured tones of the wonders that awaited beyond Russia's borders, of shipyards where vessels were built with precision that rivaled the work of master clockmakers, of universities where knowledge flowed like rivers feeding the sea, of courts where diplomacy was practiced as an art form refined over centuries. The idea that would become known as the Grand Embassy began to take shape not in council chambers or throne rooms, but in these quiet moments of contemplation, where a young ruler allowed his mind to wander beyond the confines of tradition and precedent. Peter understood, with an intuition that seemed to come from the very depths of his being, that if Russia were to take her place among the great powers of the world, she must first learn from those who'd already achieved such greatness. As the new year of 1697 dawned, bringing with it the promise of longer days and the eventual retreat of winter's grip, Peter announced his intention to undertake a journey that would astonish his subjects and concern his enemies. The Grand Embassy, as it came to be known, would be far more than a diplomatic mission. It would be a voyage of discovery, a quest for knowledge that would transform not only Peter himself but the very soul of Russia. The preparation for this unprecedented journey occupied the early months of 1697, as messengers rode across the snow-covered roads to arrange safe passage and accommodations, as interpreters practiced their languages and diplomats studied the customs of foreign courts. Peter threw himself into these preparations with the same passionate intensity he brought to all his endeavours, but beneath the excitement lay something deeper, a recognition that he was about to step into a larger world, one where Russia had long been regarded as a distant and mysterious land on the edge of civilization. On the 9th day of March, 1697, as the first tentative signs of spring began to appear in the Russian countryside, the Grand Embassy departed Moscow in a procession that stretched for miles along the muddy roads. At its head rode the official ambassadors, Franz Lefort, Feodor Golovin, and Prokopy Voznitsin, men chosen to represent the dignity and power of the Russian state. But travelling among the lesser members of the embassy, disguised as a simple volunteer named Peter Mikhailov, was the Tsar himself, eager to learn and observe without the burden of ceremony that his true identity would bring. The journey to the west was long and often arduous, as the great procession made its way through the forests and plains of Eastern Europe. Peter used these weeks of travel to prepare himself for what lay ahead, studying languages with his tutors, practicing the skills of seamanship and navigation that would serve him well in the shipyards of Holland and England. As they passed through the territories of various princes and kings, he observed everything with the keen eye of one who sought to understand not just the surface of things, but their deeper meaning and purpose. The first major stop of the Grand Embassy was in Riga, the ancient Hanseatic city that commanded the eastern shores of the Baltic Sea. Here Peter encountered for the first time the reality of Swedish power that dominated these northern waters. The great fortress of Riga, with its massive walls and bristling cannons, stood as a testament to Sweden's control over the Baltic trade, routes that were so vital to the prosperity of northern Europe. As Peter walked the ramparts of Riga under the pale northern sun, still maintaining his disguise as Peter Mikhailov, he felt both admiration and frustration at what he saw. The Swedish engineers had built their fortifications with a skill and precision that spoke of centuries of military experience, while the bustling port below told the story of a maritime empire that had grown rich on the control of trade and navigation. But Peter also sensed something else in these Baltic winds, an opportunity that might one day present itself to a Russia that had learned to build ships and train sailors who could match the best that Sweden had to offer. The Swedish governor of Riga, suspicious of this large Russian embassy, and perhaps sensing that it contained more than met the eye, was less than welcoming to his eastern visitors. Peter found himself subjected to petty restrictions and deliberate slights that burned in his memory long after the embassy had moved on. As their carriages rolled westward away from the Baltic shores, Peter gazed back at the receding walls of Riga and made a silent promise to himself. One day Russia would return to these waters not as supplicants seeking passage, but as masters of their own destiny. The journey continued through the German territories, where Peter encountered a world of small states and principalities, each with its own character and customs. In Brandenburg he was received with greater courtesy, and began to form the diplomatic connections that would serve Russia well in the years to come. But it was as they approached the borders of the Dutch Republic that Peter felt his excitement mounting, for here lay the heart of European maritime knowledge, the workshops and shipyards where the secrets of oceanic navigation were forged into wood and iron. Nothing could have prepared Peter for his first sight of Amsterdam, that great commercial metropolis built upon the intersection of rivers and canals, where the wealth of the world's oceans seemed to flow through streets lined with the mansions of merchant princes. As the Grand Embassy made its formal entry into the city in the late summer of 1697, Peter felt as if he had entered a different world entirely, one where human ingenuity had tamed both water and wind to serve the purposes of trade and empire. The canals of Amsterdam, with their endless procession of vessels carrying goods from every corner of the known world, spoke to Peter of possibilities that had scarcely existed in his imagination. Here were ships designed not for war but for commerce, their holds filled with spices from the Indies, timber from the Baltic, grain from distant shores. The very air seemed to hum with the activity of a people who had made the sea their highway and the world their marketplace. But it was in the shipyards of Zaandam, just north of Amsterdam, that Peter truly found his element. Here, abandoning the formalities of his diplomatic mission, he donned the simple clothes of a ship's carpenter and threw himself into the work of learning how the Dutch had become the masters of maritime construction. With hands that had been softened by the privileges of royalty, he learned to shape timber with adze and plane, to understand the subtle curves that would allow a vessel to move through water with grace and speed. The Dutch shipwrights, initially sceptical of this tall young Russian, who claimed to want nothing more than to learn their trade, gradually came to respect his dedication and quick intelligence. Peter worked from dawn to dusk in those shipyards, his royal identity known to few, his hands growing calloused as he mastered the ancient skills that had made the Dutch the carriers of the world's commerce. In the evenings, by candlelight in modest lodgings, he would fill notebooks with drawings and calculations, recording every detail of what he had learned. The months passed like a dream for Peter in Holland, each day bringing new revelations about the possibilities that lay within human reach when knowledge was pursued with passion and persistence. He visited the workshops where lenses were ground for telescopes and microscopes, marvelling at instruments that could bring distant stars close enough to study or reveal the hidden world of tiny creatures invisible to the naked eye. In the halls of learned societies, he listened to discussions of mathematics and natural philosophy that opened his mind to ways of understanding the world that had never been explored in Russia. But perhaps most importantly, Peter began to understand something about the nature of progress itself. The Dutch had not achieved their mastery through force of arms alone, but through the patient accumulation of knowledge, the careful observation of natural phenomena, and the willingness to adapt and improve upon the discoveries of others. Their prosperity rested not on the size of their territory or the number of their subjects, but on their ability to innovate and to make the most efficient use of their resources. As winter approached and the Dutch shipyards began to slow their pace, Peter felt the pull of another destination, England, that island kingdom whose naval power had grown to challenge even the Dutch for mastery of the seas. The crossing of the English Channel in January of 1698 was Peter's first experience of oceanic sailing, and as he stood on the deck of the packet boat and watched the white cliffs of Dover rise from the grey waters, he felt that he was approaching the source of mysteries that had long fascinated him. London, when he finally reached it after the journey from Dover, was like nothing Peter had ever imagined. If Amsterdam had impressed him with its commercial energy, London overwhelmed him with its sheer scale and the evident power of the kingdom it represented. The Thames, broader and more majestic than the rivers of Russia, carried a traffic of vessels that spoke of an empire whose reach extended to the farthest corners of the earth. At the naval yards of Deptford, Peter found himself in the presence of the Royal Navy, that institution which had become the guardian of England's growing empire and the guarantor of her prosperity. Here were ships of the line whose massive cannons could reduce the strongest fortress to rubble, but which were built with an attention to design and craftsmanship that reflected centuries of accumulated experience. Peter spent weeks in these yards, once again donning working clothes and learning the secrets of English shipbuilding, noting the differences between Dutch and English methods, and understanding how each nation had adapted its techniques to serve its particular needs. The English, like the Dutch, gradually warmed to this enthusiastic young Russian who showed such genuine interest in their methods and such willingness to work with his own hands. Through the personal intervention of William III, who had heard reports of the visiting Tsar's unconventional approach to learning, Peter was granted access to facilities and information that few foreigners had ever been permitted to see. In the workshops of Greenwich, he studied the instruments of navigation that guided English ships across the vast expanses of the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. But it was during a visit to Parliament that Peter encountered something that would trouble his thoughts for years to come. Here was a form of government unlike anything he had known in Russia, where the power of the monarch was balanced and constrained by the representatives of the people. The debates he witnessed in the House of Commons, where merchants and gentlemen argued the merits of various policies with a freedom that would have been unthinkable in Moscow, showed him a different model of how a nation might be governed. Peter's stay in England stretched through the spring of 1698, each week bringing new experiences and new understanding. He visited factories where new methods of manufacturing were transforming the production of goods. He observed experiments in natural philosophy that revealed the hidden laws governing the behaviour of matter and energy, and he met with scholars and inventors whose work was pushing forward the boundaries of human knowledge. The England he encountered was a nation in the midst of transformation, where traditional ways were being challenged and improved upon at every turn. As summer approached, Peter began to feel the pull of home growing stronger. The letters that reached him from Russia spoke of troubles brewing in Moscow, of discontent among the Streltsy, and concerns about the stability of his realm in his absence. But there was also his own sense that he had absorbed as much as he could from his Western teachers, and that the time had come to begin the great work of applying what he had learned to the transformation of Russia herself. The return journey began in the early summer of 1698, but it would not follow the leisurely pace of the outward voyage. News reached the embassy while they were still in Vienna that the Streltsy had risen in rebellion, threatening the very foundations of Peter's rule. The great educational journey that had begun with such hope and excitement now took on the urgency of a race against time, as Peter and his companions hastened across the dusty roads of Central Europe toward an uncertain fate. As their carriages rolled eastward through the familiar landscapes of Poland and Lithuania, Peter found himself reflecting on all that he had seen and learned during these transformative months. The notebooks he carried were filled with drawings and observations, plans and calculations that would serve as the foundation for the great reforms he envisioned. But more than the technical knowledge, he carried within himself a new understanding of what Russia might become, not merely a vast collection of territories united by the fear of autocratic power, but a modern state capable of competing with the greatest nations of Europe. The workshops of Holland had shown him how human skill and ingenuity could transform raw materials into objects of beauty and utility. The shipyards of England had revealed the secrets of naval power that could project a nation's influence across the vast expanses of the ocean. The universities and learned societies he had visited had demonstrated how the systematic pursuit of knowledge could unlock the mysteries of the natural world and place them at the service of human progress. But perhaps most importantly, Peter had come to understand that true greatness lay not in the preservation of ancient traditions, but in the willingness to learn from others and to adapt to changing circumstances. The Russia to which he was now returning would need to undergo a transformation as complete as his own, and he was prepared to dedicate his life to making that transformation a reality. The dust clouds on the eastern horizon spoke of urgent messengers, their horses lathered with foam, and their faces grim with news that would shatter the peaceful contemplation of Peter's homeward journey. As the Grand Embassy made its way through the borderlands between the Polish Commonwealth and Russia in the late summer of 1698, each day brought fresh reports of turmoil in Moscow, of ancient forces rising against the changes that Peter's very existence represented. The Streltsy, those bearded guardians of old Russia, whose very presence had haunted Peter's childhood memories, had once again taken up their weapons in rebellion. But this time, their target was not merely the political arrangements of the moment, but the entire direction in which their young Tsar seemed determined to lead their nation. They'd heard rumours of his activities in the West, of his willingness to work with his hands like a common craftsman, of his apparent preference for foreign companions over the boyars and clergy who had traditionally guided Russian rulers. To the Streltsy, these reports represented nothing less than the betrayal of everything that made Russia distinctive and worthy of respect. They had served as the guardians of Russian orthodoxy and tradition for generations, and now they saw those traditions threatened by a ruler who seemed more interested in imitating foreigners than in preserving the sacred customs of his ancestors. In their barracks and taverns, they spoke of restoration, of bringing Peter's half-sister Sophia back from her convent to rule, in place of a Tsar who had apparently forgotten his duties to his own people. As the reports reached Peter's party on the dusty roads of Lithuania, the full scope of the crisis became clear. The Streltsy had marched from their frontier post toward Moscow, gathering supporters along the way and proclaiming their intention to purge the government of foreign influences and restore Russia to her traditional ways. They spoke of Peter with a mixture of disappointment and anger, portraying him as a ruler who had been corrupted by Western ideas and who could no longer be trusted to govern in accordance with Russian traditions. Peter received this news with a calmness that surprised even his closest companions. The months he had spent in the West had given him not only technical knowledge and new perspectives on government, but also a deeper understanding of his own capabilities and responsibilities. The frightened young man who had fled to the Trinity Monastery in 1689 was gone, replaced by a ruler who had seen how other nations dealt with challenges to their authority and who was prepared to apply those lessons to his own circumstances. The embassy's pace quickened as they crossed into Russian territory, but Peter was in no hurry to reach Moscow before he had fully understood the situation and prepared his response. At each stopping place he gathered information about the extent of the rebellion, the loyalty of various military units, and the mood of the people in different regions. What he learned confirmed his worst fears. The Streltsy revolt was not merely a military uprising, but a manifestation of deeper resistance to the changes he envisioned for Russia. By the time Peter reached the outskirts of Moscow in early September, the immediate military threat had been contained by loyal forces under the command of Alexei Shine and Patrick Gordon, his Scottish general. The Streltsy had been defeated in battle, and many had been captured, but Peter understood that the real battle, the struggle for the soul of Russia herself, was only beginning. The question that faced him now was not merely how to punish the rebels, but how to ensure that such resistance to necessary change would never again threaten the progress of his realm. The Moscow to which Peter returned after 18 months abroad seemed both familiar and strange, like a childhood home revisited after years of absence. The golden domes of the Kremlin still gleamed in the autumn, sunshine, and the streets still teemed with the same mixture of merchants, craftsmen, and common folk who had always formed the human fabric of the city. But Peter's eyes, trained now to see possibilities where others saw only custom, perceived everywhere the signs of a society that had remained static while the rest of Europe surged forward into new ways of thinking and living. The investigation and punishment of the Streltsy rebellion occupied the remainder of 1698 and extended well into the following year. Peter approached this grim task with the same methodical attention to detail that he had brought to learning shipbuilding in Holland or navigation in England. Each rebel was interrogated carefully, not merely to determine his individual guilt or innocence, but to understand the deeper currents of discontent that had made the rebellion possible. What emerged from these investigations was a picture of a society divided against itself, torn between the pull of ancient traditions and the pressure of changing circumstances. The Streltsy who had risen in rebellion were not merely malcontents or troublemakers, but men who genuinely believed that they were defending something sacred and valuable against forces that threatened its destruction. Their fear of change was rooted not in laziness or stupidity, but in a deep attachment to ways of life that had served their ancestors for centuries. Peter's response to this challenge was characteristically direct and uncompromising. The leaders of the rebellion were executed, their death serving as a clear warning to others who might be tempted to resist the changes he intended to implement. But the executions were carried out not in a spirit of vengeful anger, but as a necessary demonstration that the authority of the state could not be challenged with impunity. Peter himself participated in some of the executions, wielding the axe with his own hands to show that he would not shrink from the hardest duties of leadership. The symbolic aspects of Peter's response were as important as the practical ones. He ordered that the bodies of executed Streltsy be displayed outside the windows of Sophia's convent cell, a grim reminder to his half-sister of the consequences of attempting to subvert his authority. The beards that the Streltsy had worn as symbols of their adherence to traditional Russian values were collected and preserved, tangible evidence of the old ways that would no longer be permitted to obstruct necessary progress. But even as he dealt firmly with those who had opposed him, Peter began to implement the positive changes that his Western journey had inspired. The beard tax, one of his first and most symbolic reforms, required Russian men to pay for the privilege of maintaining their traditional facial hair or submit to having it shaved in the Western fashion. This seemingly trivial requirement struck at the heart of Russian identity, forcing his subjects to choose between their attachment to ancient customs and their desire to avoid financial penalty. The resistance to this and other reforms was immediate and widespread, but Peter had anticipated such opposition and was prepared to deal with it. he understood that changing the external appearance of his subjects was only the first step in a much larger transformation, one that would ultimately touch every aspect of Russian society. The months following his return from the West were filled with a constant stream of new regulations and requirements, each designed to move Russia closer to the European model he had observed during his travels. Among the reforms that followed Peter's return from the West, few had as profound an impact on the daily lives of ordinary Russians as his decision to adopt the Western calendar. For centuries, Russia had calculated years from what they believed to be the creation of the world, a system that placed them thousands of years out of step with the rest of Europe. More fundamentally, the Russian New Year began in September, following ancient Byzantine traditions that had long since been abandoned in the West. Peter's decree that Russia would henceforth follow the Western calendar, with years numbered from the birth of Christ and the New Year beginning on January 1st, seemed to many of his subjects like an attack on the very foundations of their understanding of time and history. The change would take effect on January 1st, 1700, and Peter ordered that it be celebrated with festivities that would demonstrate Russia's new alignment with European customs. The symbolic importance of this reform extended far beyond mere convenience in dealing with foreign nations. By changing how Russians measured time itself, Peter was asserting his authority over one of the most fundamental aspects of human experience. The old calendar had connected his subjects to their ancestors and to the religious traditions that had shaped their understanding of their place in the cosmic order. The new calendar tied them instead to the secular rhythms of European civilization and to a future that would be measured by progress rather than by fidelity to ancient ways. As the year 1699 drew to a close under the old system, Peter ordered elaborate preparations for the celebration that would mark Russia's entry into the new chronological age. Moscow was decorated with evergreen branches and illuminated with thousands of candles, while musicians prepared to play melodies learned from Western composers. The festivities were designed to demonstrate that change need not mean the loss of joy or celebration, but could instead open new possibilities for human happiness and achievement. When the moment came, as church bells rang out across the snow-covered city and fireworks lit the winter sky, many Russians felt that they were witnessing not merely the beginning of a new year, but the birth of a new nation. The past had not been erased, but it had been placed in a new context, one that looked forward to possibilities that had never before seemed within reach. Even as Peter grappled with the domestic challenges of reform and the lingering aftermath of the Streltsy rebellion, his mind was drawn increasingly to the unfinished business that lay beyond Russia's southern borders. The fortress of Azov, that ancient guardian of the passage between the Sea of Azov and the Don River, still flew the Turkish flag, and its continued presence in Ottoman hands represented a barrier to Peter's dreams of Russian naval power. The first attempt to capture Azov, launched in 1695 while Peter was still learning the basic arts of war and statecraft, had ended in failure that served as a harsh lesson in the realities of military command. The young Tsar had approached that campaign with the enthusiasm of youth and the confidence born of success in his military games, only to discover that real warfare bore little resemblance to the mock battles of his childhood. The Turkish defenders, seasoned by generations of frontier conflict, had proven more than a match for Russian forces that were still organized along traditional lines. But failure, Peter had learned during his travels in the West, was often the beginning of wisdom rather than its end. The Dutch shipwrights who had taught him their craft spoke often of vessels that had foundered on their first voyages, only to be rebuilt with improvements that made them among the finest ships on the seas. The English engineers whose work he had studied told similar stories of fortifications that had been overrun, only to be redesigned according to principles that made them virtually impregnable. As winter gave way to spring in 1696, Peter applied these lessons to the challenge of Azov. The failure of his first attempt had taught him that success would require not merely courage and determination, but careful planning, adequate supplies, and above all, the naval forces necessary to blockade the fortress from the sea. Without control of the waters around Azov, any land-based siege would be undermined by the ability of Turkish vessels to bring in reinforcements and supplies. The solution to this problem lay in the shipbuilding program that Peter initiated during the winter months of 1695 to 1696. Working with frantic energy at the yards he established at Voronezh, on the banks of the Don River, Russian craftsmen laboured to construct the vessels that would give their nation its first effective naval force. These ships were crude by the standards Peter would later observe in Amsterdam and London, but they represented something unprecedented in Russian history: the projection of Russian power beyond the land boundaries that had always defined the limits of the Tsar's authority. The ships that took shape in the Voronezh yards during those winter months were built not merely of timber and iron, but of hopes and dreams that had never before found physical expression in Russian society. For the first time, Russian carpenters and craftsmen were creating instruments that would allow their nation to compete on equal terms with the great maritime powers of Europe. The skills they learned in building these vessels would serve as the foundation for the far greater naval programs that would follow in later years. As spring advanced towards summer in 1696, Peter gathered the forces that would participate in his second attempt on Azov. The army that assembled was larger and better organised than the force that had failed the previous year, but more importantly, it was supported by the small fleet that had been built during the winter months. For the first time in Russian history, land and sea forces would operate in coordination, each supporting the other in pursuit of a common objective. The march south toward Azov in the early summer of 1696 had something of the character of a triumphant procession, as Russian forces moved through territories that had never before witnessed such a display of their nation's military capabilities. The ships that accompanied the army down the Don River were greeted with amazement by the populations along the banks, who had never imagined that Russia might one day challenge the Turkish monopoly of navigation in these southern waters. The fortress of Azov, when it finally came into view across the waters of the Don estuary, was far more formidable than Peter had imagined during his first campaign. Its massive walls, built of stone quarried from the steppes and reinforced by generations of Turkish engineers, rose from the water's edge like a natural feature of the landscape. The cannon that crowned its battlements spoke of the determination of its defenders to maintain Ottoman control over this crucial gateway between Europe and Asia. But Peter had not come to Azov as the inexperienced young commander who had retreated in defeat the previous year. The months he had spent studying military engineering, combined with the hard lessons of his first failure, had given him a deeper understanding of the complexities of siege warfare. More importantly, he now possessed the naval forces necessary to complete the blockade that would be essential to victory. The siege that began in early July 1696 was conducted with a methodical precision that reflected Peter's growing mastery of military arts. Russian engineers working under the guidance of foreign advisors who had been recruited during the preparation phase constructed the elaborate system of trenches and artillery positions that would be necessary to reduce the fortress. The ships of the new Russian fleet took up positions in the waters around Azov, cutting off the supply lines that had previously allowed the Turkish garrison to resist indefinitely. As the summer weeks passed and the siege lines tightened around Azov, Peter felt the intoxicating sense of power that comes from the successful coordination of complex forces toward a single objective. The artillery bombardment that began in late July gradually reduced sections of the fortress walls to rubble, while the naval blockade ensured that no relief could reach the defenders. For the first time in his military career, Peter was experiencing the satisfaction of a plan executed successfully from beginning to end. The surrender of Azov in August 1696 marked a turning point not only in Russian military history, but in Peter's own understanding of his capabilities as a ruler and commander. The Turkish garrison, recognizing that further resistance would be futile, negotiated terms that allowed them to withdraw with their weapons and personal belongings. As Russian flags were raised over the conquered fortress, Peter felt that he had achieved something that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. But victory at Azov was significant for reasons that extended far beyond the military advantages it provided. The success of the campaign demonstrated to Russians and foreigners alike that Peter's reforms were producing tangible results, that the changes he was implementing were not merely cosmetic alterations, but fundamental improvements in Russian capabilities. The naval forces that had made victory possible represented the beginning of Russia's transformation from a purely land-based power to a nation capable of projecting its influence across the seas. The celebrations that followed the capture of Azov were designed to demonstrate the significance of the victory to all of Russian society. Triumphal processions in Moscow featured the display of captured Turkish weapons and banners, while the officers and men who'd participated in the campaign were rewarded with honours and promotions that established new precedents for recognising military service. Peter himself participated in these celebrations not as a distant autocrat, accepting the homage of his subjects, but as a commander who had shared the dangers and hardships of the campaign. The strategic consequences of the victory at Azov extended far beyond the immediate military advantages it provided. Russian control of the fortress opened new possibilities for trade and communication with the peoples of the Caucasus and the Black Sea region, while the naval forces that had made victory possible could be expanded and improved to challenge Ottoman dominance throughout the eastern Mediterranean. But perhaps most importantly, the success at Azov provided Peter with the confidence and credibility necessary to pursue the far more ambitious reforms that his western journey had inspired. As autumn settled over the conquered fortress and Russian engineers began the work of repairing and strengthening its defences, Peter looked southward toward the Black Sea with dreams that would have seemed fantastic just a few years earlier. The small fleet that had made victory at Azov possible was only the beginning of what he envisioned. A Russian navy capable of challenging the greatest maritime powers of Europe and carrying Russian influence to the farthest corners of the world's oceans. The victory at Azov had proven that such dreams were not impossible, and Peter was prepared to dedicate his life to making them reality. The triumph echoed across the vast expanses of his realm like the sound of church bells carried on the wind, bringing news of a new Russia to villages and towns that had never before had reason to dream of naval victories or foreign conquests. In the workshops where craftsmen laboured over their ancient trades, in the fields where peasants followed the rhythms of planting and harvest that had sustained their ancestors for generations, the word spread that their young Tsar had achieved something unprecedented in the annals of Russian history. As winter closed over the land and the southern rivers began their annual transformation into highways of ice, Peter returned to Moscow with his mind already turning toward the greater challenges that lay ahead. The victory at Azov had been significant, but it was only the first step on a journey that would take Russia far from the familiar paths of her past toward a destiny that few of his subjects could yet imagine. The dawn of July 8th, 1709, broke crimson over the Ukrainian steppes, as if the sky itself knew that blood would soon stain the earth beneath the walls of Poltava. Peter stood in his tent, maps scattered before him like fallen leaves, his calloused hands tracing the lines that would determine the fate of nations. The young Swedish king, Charles XII, had marched deep into Russian territory, his army a golden blade thrust toward the heart of Peter's empire. But Peter was no longer the boy who had fled in terror from the Moscow Streltsy. 27 years of rule had forged him into something harder, sharper, a Tsar who had learned that empires were built not just on dreams, but on the precise mathematics of cannon fire and the disciplined march of infantry. The Swedish army had been magnificent once, their blue and yellow banners snapping in the wind as they swept across the Baltic lands like a northern storm. Charles XII, barely 27 years old, had already humbled Denmark, crushed Poland, and sent Russian armies fleeing in panic at Narva nearly a decade before. He was called the Lion of the North, the Alexander of his age, and his soldiers followed him with the devotion of crusaders. But the Russian winter had been their first enemy, and the vast distances of Peter's realm their second. By the time they reached Poltava, the Swedish force that had once numbered 35,000 had dwindled to less than 20,000, their uniforms patched and worn, their faces gaunt with hunger. Peter had learned the art of patience during these long years of war. While Charles had pursued him across the steppes, Peter had rebuilt his army piece by piece, moulding it in the image of the Western forces he had studied during his grand embassy. Russian soldiers now marched in Prussian formations, fired Austrian muskets, and followed officers, trained in the military academies of Europe. The lessons of Narva had been written in blood and defeat, but Peter had read them well. He would not make the same mistakes twice. The fortress of Poltava itself seemed to crouch beneath the summer sky like a sleeping giant. Its walls had withstood Swedish bombardment for weeks, the garrison commanded by Colonel Kellin holding fast while Peter manoeuvred his main army into position. The defenders had grown thin on rations and thinner on hope, but they held because they knew their Tsar was coming. Peter had sent them word through runners who slipped past Swedish sentries in the darkness. "Hold fast, be strong, the storm is nearly upon us." On the morning of battle, Peter rose before dawn and walked among his soldiers as they prepared their weapons and whispered their prayers. He wore a simple green uniform, indistinguishable from his officers, except for the star of the Order of Saint. Andrew gleaming on his chest. His hair, now touched with grey at the temples, was pulled back severely, and his pale blue eyes held the steady light of absolute conviction. These men had followed him through defeat and victory, through the frozen marshes of Livonia and the burning summer of the Ukraine. They had built his navy with their own hands, raised his new capital from the swamps of the Neva, and transformed themselves from medieval levies into a modern European army. The Swedish attack began at dawn, their remaining cavalry charging across the open ground toward Peter's redoubts, earthen fortifications that had been carefully constructed to channel the enemy assault into killing fields. Charles himself, wounded in the foot from a reconnaissance skirmish weeks before, was carried into battle on a litter, his pale face twisted with pain, but his eyes burning with undiminished ambition. He'd come too far to turn back now, had risked too much to accept anything less than total victory. But Peter's redoubts held. Swedish cavalry, the finest in Europe, shattered themselves against Russian earthworks like waves against stone. The morning air filled with the thunder of cannon and the crack of musketry, with the screams of horses and the shouted commands of officers trying to rally their scattered units. Swedish infantry, exhausted from their long march and weakened by months of inadequate supplies, found their famous discipline cracking under the relentless pressure of Russian fire. By midday, the battle had become a rout. Swedish forces, caught between Peter's redoubts and his advancing main army, broke and fled toward the Dnieper River. Charles himself, barely conscious from pain and fever, was bundled into a carriage and spirited away toward the Ottoman frontier, leaving behind the wreckage of the army that had once been the terror of northern Europe. Peter, mounted on his great black stallion, surveyed the field where Swedish bodies lay scattered like broken dolls among the summer grass. That evening in his tent lit. Flickering candles, Peter wrote dispatches to be carried by swift couriers to every corner of his empire. "The enemy," he wrote in his careful, precise hand, "has been utterly defeated. God has granted Russia a great victory." But even as he wrote these words of triumph, Peter understood that Poltava was more than a military victory. It was the moment when Russia announced itself as a great power, when the backward Muscovite state of his childhood transformed definitively into the Russian Empire. The captured Swedish officers were brought before Peter that night, their blue uniforms torn and mud-stained, their faces bearing the hollow look of men who had seen their world collapse in a single day. Among them was Count Piper, Charles XII's chief minister, a man who had once dismissed Russian military capabilities with elegant contempt. Now he stood before the Tsar he had underestimated, his head bowed in defeat. Peter received them with the unexpected courtesy, ordering wine to be brought, and speaking to them in the German that had become his diplomatic language. "Gentlemen," he said, raising his cup, "I drink to my teachers in the art of war." The irony was gentle but unmistakable. These Swedish officers, who had once seemed invincible, had indeed been his teachers, but the lesson they had taught him was how to defeat them. Even as the echoes of Poltava still rang across Europe, Peter's attention had already turned to his greatest creation, the city rising from the marshes of the Neva Delta like a dream made manifest in stone and timber. St. Petersburg, named not for himself but for his patron saint, had begun 6 years earlier as nothing more than a fortress on a captured Swedish island, a strategic necessity in his war for access to the Baltic. But what had started as military pragmatism had evolved into something far grander, a new capital that would serve as Russia's window to Europe, a city that would embody all his dreams of transforming his backward realm into a modern European power. The site itself seemed to mock human ambition. The Neva Delta was a wilderness of islands and marshes, swept by icy winds from the Gulf of Finland, flooded regularly by storms that drove Baltic waters inland with devastating force. Wolves prowled the pine forests, and in summer the air thick with mosquitoes that rose in clouds from the stagnant pools. Foreign observers who saw Peter's plans declared him mad. What sane man would build a great city in such a place? But Peter had learned to see with different eyes during his travels in Holland and England. He had walked the orderly streets of Amsterdam, had marvelled at the precise engineering of Dutch canals and the mathematical perfection of English gardens. He understood that human will, properly applied, could reshape the very landscape. If the Dutch could create a nation below sea level, if the English could build great ports where none had existed before, then surely Russia could carve a magnificent city from these northern marshes. The work began with the Peter and Paul Fortress, constructed on Zayaki Island in the heart of the Delta. Peter himself laid the first stones on May 27th, 1703, cutting squares of turf with a bayonet and declaring that here would stand a city greater than any in the north. The fortress rose with astonishing speed, its star-shaped walls following the latest principles of military engineering, its bastions bristling with cannon that could command the entire width of the Neva River. But Peter's vision extended far beyond military necessity. As Swedish prisoners of war laboured alongside Russian peasants to drain the marshes and raise the foundations, the Tsar was already planning boulevards and palaces, churches and theatres, all arranged according to geometric principles that would make his city a showcase of rational urban planning. He recruited architects from across Europe, Domenico Tracini from Switzerland, Jean-Baptiste Leblanc from France, Bartolomeo Rastrelli from Italy. Each brought their own expertise, their own interpretation of Baroque grandeur, but all worked toward Peter's singular vision of a city that would announce Russia's arrival as a European power. The human cost was staggering. Tens of thousands of workers died during the early years of construction, their bodies claimed by disease, exhaustion, and the brutal accidents that accompanied such massive undertakings. The marshes seemed to swallow human effort as eagerly as they swallowed the timber and stone that formed the city's foundations. Foreign diplomats reported that bones could be found in every foundation, that the city was literally built on the graves of those who died creating it. Peter himself lived simply during these years, occupying a modest wooden house on the Petersburg side while palaces rose around him. He rose before dawn to inspect construction sites, wading through mud and standing water to examine the progress of his dreams. His hands remained calloused from his shipbuilding days, and he was not above taking up tools himself when the work required it. The nobility, summoned from their estates to take up residence in the new capital, found their Tsar to be not a distant autocrat but a working partner in the great enterprise of creation. The city took shape according to Peter's iron will. The Nevsky Prospect, the great boulevard that would become the city's main artery, stretched in a perfectly straight line from the Admiralty to the Alexander Nevsky Monastery, its width calculated to accommodate the grandest processions and military parades. The Winter Palace, rising on the banks of the Neva itself, proclaimed Russian imperial power through the sheer audacity of its scale and decoration. The 12 colleges housing Peter's new governmental departments demonstrated his commitment to rational administration modelled on Western European practices. But it was the Admiralty that revealed Peter's truest priorities. This vast complex, with its golden spire crowned by a ship weather vane, served as both shipyard and symbol. Here, under Peter's personal supervision, Russian carpenters learned to build ships that could match anything produced in the dockyards of London or Amsterdam. The sound of hammers and saws echoed across the water from dawn to dusk, as the Baltic fleet took shape plank by plank, gun by gun. Foreign visitors, arriving by ship through the Gulf of Finland, found themselves confronting a city that seemed to have materialized overnight. The French ambassador described it as a magnificent improvisation, while the English envoy marvelled at the speed with which wilderness had been transformed into urban splendour. But perhaps the most perceptive observer was the Italian architect Rastrelli, who noted that St. Petersburg was unlike any other European capital because it had been created not by centuries of gradual growth, but by a single commanding vision imposed upon an unwilling landscape. The city attracted merchants and craftsmen, diplomats and adventurers, scholars and artists from across Europe. Peter had declared that anyone with useful skills would find welcome in his new capital, regardless of their nationality or religion. The result was a cosmopolitan atmosphere, unlike anything Russia had ever known. French was spoken in the salons, German in the workshops, Italian in the theatres, and Dutch in the shipyards, while Russian remained the language of government and Orthodox faith. In 1712, Peter officially transferred the Russian capital from Moscow to St. Petersburg. Petersburg, a decision that shocked traditionalists who saw it as an abandonment of Russia's ancient heritage. Moscow, with its onion domes and winding medieval streets, represented the old Muscovite of the boyars and the patriarchs. St. Petersburg, with its classical facades and geometric planning, embodied the new Russia that Peter was determined to create. While St. Petersburg rose from the marshes as the physical symbol of Peter's new Russia, a deeper transformation was reshaping the very soul of the empire. The Tsar, who had once played at soldier with wooden swords in the German quarter, now wielded the full power of autocracy to remake his realm according to European models. Every aspect of Russian life fell under his reforming gaze: government, church, military, society, even the most intimate details of dress and personal behaviour. The old system of governance, with its bewildering array of overlapping jurisdictions and ancient privileges, gave way to Peter's streamlined administrative machine. The Boyar Council, that assembly of ancient nobles who had advised Russian rulers for centuries, was simply abolished, replaced by a senate of Peter's own choosing. The traditional ministries, with their archaic titles and medieval procedures, were reorganized as Western-style colleges, each with clearly defined responsibilities and professional staff. Peter's table of ranks, introduced in 1722, revolutionized Russian society by establishing a meritocratic system that allowed commoners to achieve noble status through service to the state. Under the old system, birth alone determined social position, and noble families jealously guarded their privileges across generations. Now, a peasant's son could theoretically rise to the highest offices of the empire through demonstrated ability and loyal service. The table created 14 ranks in military, civil, and court service, with automatic ennoblement accompanying advancement to the 8th rank. The transformation extended to the Russian Orthodox Church, that ancient institution which had shaped the spiritual life of the empire for 7 centuries. Peter abolished the Patriarchate itself, replacing it with a holy synod modelled on the Protestant churches of Northern Europe. The Church, while retaining its liturgical traditions and theological independence, became essentially a department of the state, its highest officials appointed by the Tsar and responsible to him for their administration. Perhaps no reform was more visible or more resented than Peter's assault on traditional Russian appearance and customs. The famous beard tax, imposed in 1698, required any man who wished to maintain facial hair to purchase an annual permit and carry a bronze token proving payment. Clean-shaven faces, Peter argued, were the mark of civilized European men, while beards belonged to the barbarous past that Russia must leave behind. Barbers were stationed at the gates of Moscow and St. Petersburg, ready to enforce the new standard on unwilling subjects. The traditional Russian clothing, long robes, tall fur hats, flowing sleeves, was banned at court and in government service, replaced by Western European fashions that Peter himself had admired during his grand embassy. Men were required to wear short coats, breeches, and powdered wigs, while women abandoned their concealing traditional dress for the low-cut gowns and elaborate hairstyles of French fashion. These changes, seemingly superficial, carried deep symbolic weight. They announced to Europe that Russia was ready to join the community of civilized nations, while signalling to Russians themselves that their old ways of life were no longer acceptable. education, virtually non-existent in Old Muscovy beyond basic literacy instruction for clergy and government clerks, became a central focus of Peter's reforms. The School of Mathematical and Navigational Sciences, established in Moscow's Sukharev Tower, trained the technical specialists needed for Peter's new navy and army. The Academy of Sciences, founded in 1724, brought European scholars to Russia and sent promising Russians abroad for advanced study. Primary schools were established in provincial towns, their curricula emphasizing practical subjects like mathematics, geography, and modern languages rather than the traditional religious instruction. Peter's economic reforms were equally comprehensive. He established state monopolies in key industries, founded new manufacturing enterprises, and recruited foreign technical experts to modernize Russian production. The Ural Mountains, previously known only for their iron deposits, became the center of a growing metallurgical industry that would eventually supply cannon and muskets not only for Russian forces but for export to European customers. Textile manufactories, following patterns Peter had observed in Holland and England, began producing cloth that could compete with foreign imports. The changes extended to the most intimate aspects of social life. Peter ordered that marriages among the nobility could no longer be arranged without the consent of both parties, a revolutionary concept in a society where matrimonial alliances had always been matters of family strategy, rather than personal choice. He encouraged social mixing between men and women, replacing the traditional segregation of Russian society with mixed assemblies modelled on Western European social practices. The calendar itself was reformed, with Russia abandoning its traditional dating system that counted years from the supposed creation of the world in favour of the Western European practice of dating from the birth of Christ. New Year's Day was moved from September to January, bringing Russian practice into alignment with the rest of Europe. Even these seemingly technical changes carried profound psychological impact, as they literally redefined Russia's place in historical time. Resistance to these sweeping changes was inevitable. Old believers, those orthodox traditionalists who rejected any innovation in religious practice, saw Peter's reforms as nothing less than the work of the Antichrist. Some nobles, forced to abandon ancestral customs and adopt foreign ways, grumbled privately about the destruction of Russian traditions. Provincial communities, far from the watchful eyes of Peter's administrators, often ignored the new regulations and continued their traditional ways of life. But Peter's determination was absolute, his methods ruthless when necessary. Informers reported on violations of the dress code and beard regulations. Nobles who failed to send their sons for education abroad found their estates confiscated. Church leaders who resisted the new administrative arrangements were removed from office and exiled to remote monasteries. The Tsar, who had once been denied power by palace conspiracies, now wielded authority more complete than any Russian ruler in history. The great irony of Peter's westernization program was that it required typically Russian methods: autocratic command, violent enforcement, and the complete subordination of individual will to state power. He was creating a European-style state through distinctly non-European means, imposing Enlightenment rationality through medieval despotism. The contradiction would haunt Russian development for generations to come, as the empire struggled to reconcile its authoritarian political culture with its adopted European social and intellectual forms. By the 1720s, the transformation was largely complete. Russian diplomats at European courts were indistinguishable from their Western counterparts in dress, manners, and education. Russian officers commanded respect from their European colleagues for their professional competence and tactical skill. Russian merchants competed successfully in international markets, their goods meeting European standards of quality and design. The empire that had once seemed exotic and backward to Western observers was now recognized as a legitimate member of the European state system. Yet underneath this European veneer, Russia remained profoundly different from its Western neighbours. The vast majority of the population, the peasant serfs who made up perhaps 90% of Peter's subjects, remained largely untouched by his reforms. They continued to live in traditional wooden villages, to worship in the old manner, to dress as their ancestors had dressed for centuries. The cultural gap between the Europeanized elite and the traditional masses would become one of the defining characteristics of modern Russian society, a source of both creative tension and political instability. Peter himself seemed aware of this contradiction. In his private correspondence, he sometimes expressed frustration at the superficial nature of some changes, noting that Russians could adopt European dress and manners while retaining essentially un-European attitudes toward authority, innovation, and individual responsibility. But he believed that external changes would eventually produce internal transformation, that new forms of behavior would gradually create new ways of thinking. The wars continued even as the reforms proceeded. The Great Northern War, which had begun as a struggle for Baltic access, had evolved into a broader contest for European influence. Swedish power, broken at Poltava, continued to resist through diplomatic manoeuvring and the stubborn courage of Charles XII, who maintained his court in exile at the Ottoman fortress of Bender. Other European powers, alarmed by Russia's sudden emergence as a major force, formed coalitions designed to contain Peter's expansion. But Peter's new army and navy proved equal to every challenge. Russian ships built in the yards of St. Petersburg and manned by officers trained in European naval academies dominated the Baltic Sea. Russian armies, disciplined and equipped according to the latest European standards, won victory after victory against Swedish and Polish forces. The empire that had once been dismissed as a backward Asiatic despotism was now feared and respected from London to Vienna, from Stockholm to Constantinople. The years that followed Peter's transformation into emperor brought with them a solitude that even the grandest palaces could not dispel. In the corridors of power where his footsteps echoed against marble floors, the Tsar who had once played at war with wooden soldiers now bore the weight of an empire that stretched from the Baltic shores to the Siberian wilderness. The crown that rested upon his head carried not just gold and jewels, but the hopes and fears of millions who looked to him as their sovereign father, their terrible and wonderful giant who had dragged Russia from medieval shadows into the bright, harsh light of the modern world. In his private chambers, when the courtiers had departed and the endless stream of petitions and reports had been set aside, Peter would sometimes gaze out through tall windows toward the Neva River, watching the ships that bore his new naval ensign sailing toward distant ports. Each vessel represented a dream made manifest, a victory over the isolation that had once defined his homeland. Yet in these quiet moments, the emperor felt the peculiar loneliness that comes to those who stand atop mountains of their own making where the air grows thin and few can follow. The empire he had forged bore his mark in every stone of St. Petersburg, in every regulation that governed the daily lives of his subjects, in every uniform worn by soldiers who marched in Western formation. But empires, Peter was learning, demanded sacrifices that went deeper than treasure or blood. They required pieces of the soul, fragments of humanity that could never be reclaimed once they had been offered upon the altar of greatness. His relationship with his own family had become one of these sacrifices. Catherine, his beloved second wife, moved through the imperial apartments like a gentle spirit, her presence a source of comfort, even as the demands of rulership pulled him away from intimate moments. She had risen from the most humble origins to become Empress of all the Russias, yet she retained the warmth and directness that had first captured Peter's heart. In her arms, the Emperor could briefly forget the burden of his crown and remember what it felt like to be simply a man who loved and was loved in return. Their children brought both joy and sorrow to the imperial household. Little Anna and Elizabeth, the daughters who survived the perils of infancy that claimed so many of their siblings, played in palace gardens where once only boyars' children had walked. Peter would watch them at their games, seeing in their laughter an echo of his own childhood in Preobrazhenskoye, before the weight of kingship had settled upon his shoulders. He wanted for them a different childhood than his own, one marked by love rather than fear, by learning rather than mere survival. Yet even in these domestic moments, the shadow of his eldest son Alexis loomed like an approaching storm. The young man had grown into everything Peter was not: contemplative where his father was energetic, traditional where Peter embraced change, drawn to the old Russian ways that the Emperor had spent his life trying to transform. In Alexis, Peter saw not rebellion, but something perhaps worse, indifference to the great work that had consumed his father's entire existence. The relationship between Peter and his son Alexis had begun to fracture, long before it reached its tragic conclusion. From childhood, Alexis had been drawn to books and prayer, to the mystical traditions of Orthodox Christianity that his father viewed with suspicion and impatience. Where Peter saw in Western learning the key to Russia's future, Alexis found comfort in the ancient rituals and contemplative practices that had sustained the Russian soul for centuries. The young Tsarevich moved through the imperial court like a ghost from an earlier age, his gentle manner and scholarly interests setting him apart from the military officers and foreign advisers who formed his father's inner circle. When Peter looked at his son, he saw wasted potential, a mind that might have served the empire's modernization, but instead turned inward toward meditation and theological speculation. When Alexis looked at his father, he saw a force of nature that had reshaped the world, but at costs that seemed to him too terrible to bear. Their conversations, when they occurred at all, became exercises in mutual incomprehension. Peter would speak of ships and armies, of factories and academies, of the great destiny that awaited Russia if only its people would embrace the future he envisioned. Alexis would listen in silence, his eyes holding depths of sadness that his father could not fathom. The young man had inherited his grandfather's contemplative nature, the quality that Peter had spent his life rejecting in favour of action and transformation. As the years passed, Alexis began to attract around himself a circle of nobles and clergy who shared his reservations about Peter's reforms. They did not necessarily oppose the emperor's policies, but they mourned what Russia had lost in its rush toward westernization. In their quiet gatherings, they spoke of traditions abandoned, of customs deemed obsolete, of a spiritual heritage that seemed in danger of being forgotten in the pursuit of military and economic power. Peter watched this development with growing alarm. He had not spent decades breaking the power of the old nobility, only to see it reconstitute itself around his own son. This spectre of civil war, of the empire torn apart by succession disputes, haunted his dreams. Russia had endured too much chaos in previous centuries for him to risk a return to the dark days of competing claimants and foreign intervention. The crisis came to a head when Alexis, perhaps sensing his father's growing suspicion, chose flight over confrontation. In a decision that would seal his fate, the Tsarevich fled to Austria, seeking the protection of Emperor Charles VI. For Peter, this act represented the ultimate betrayal, not just of a son against his father, but of a Russian prince allying himself with foreign powers against his own nation. The month that followed tested Peter's character in ways that no battlefield ever had. The diplomatic efforts to secure Alexis's return, the promises of forgiveness that gradually gave way to threats, the slow realization that the young man who bore his blood had chosen exile over submission, all of this carved deep lines of anguish into the emperor's face. Those who knew him well could see how the conflict with his son aged him, adding silver to his hair and a tremor to his hands that had once been so steady. When Alexis finally returned to Russia, whether from homesickness or calculation, the tragedy entered its final act. The investigation into his flight and his connections with those who opposed Peter's reforms revealed a web of discontent that seemed to threaten the very foundations of the new Russia. In his son's actions, Peter saw not just personal betrayal, but a challenge to everything he had built, a repudiation of the sacrifices he had made for his country's future. The trial that followed would haunt Peter for the remainder of his days. In the fortress of St. Petersburg, in rooms designed to intimidate and extract truth, father and son faced each other across a chasm that could no longer be bridged. The young man who had once played at his father's feet, who had been blessed and loved and prepared for greatness, now stood accused of treason against the state that Peter had created. When Alexis died in the Peter and Paul fortress in 1718, whether from the rigours of interrogation or from the weight of his own despair, something essential died within Peter as well. The emperor who had transformed a nation, who had led armies and founded cities, who had danced at celebrations and wept at funerals, found himself confronted with a grief that no imperial power could touch. In gaining an empire, he had lost a son. In securing Russia's future, he had destroyed his own bloodline's continuity. The courtiers who attended Peter in the days following Alexis's death noticed how the emperor would sometimes pause in the middle of conversations, his eyes distant and filled with a sorrow that seemed to echo from some unreachable place within his soul. He continued to work, to plan, to build, but those closest to him could see that the fire which had driven him for so many years now burned with a different flame, one that gave light but little warmth. In the years that followed the tragedy of Alexis, Peter threw himself into his work with an intensity that bordered on desperation. It was as if he sought to outrun his grief through constant motion, to lose himself in the endless details of governing an empire that stretched across 11 time zones. The administrative reforms that had begun as practical necessities now became almost obsessive pursuits of perfection, as if creating the ideal bureaucratic system might somehow atone for the personal failures that haunted his private hours. The table of ranks, that great reorganization of Russian society that replaced hereditary privilege with merit-based advancement, occupied much of his attention during these years. In this system, Peter saw the possibility of creating a new kind of nobility, one that earned its position through service to the state rather than accidents of birth. Military officers, civil administrators, and court officials would all find their place within a rigid hierarchy that nonetheless offered opportunity for advancement to those willing to serve with distinction. The implementation of this system required countless hours of detailed work, the kind of meticulous attention to bureaucratic minutiae that might have seemed beneath the dignity of an emperor. Yet Peter found in these labours a kind of peace, a refuge from the larger questions of legacy and meaning that pressed upon him in quieter moments. Each regulation drafted, each position defined, each pathway to advancement clarified, represented another step toward the rational, efficient state he envisioned for Russia's future. His reforms extended beyond matters of rank and privilege to touch every aspect of Russian life. The establishment of the Holy Synod brought the Orthodox Church under direct state control, effectively making Peter the head of both temporal and spiritual authority in his realm. This concentration of power, which might have seemed natural to an absolute monarch, actually reflected Peter's deep concern for Russia's unity and stability in the face of the centrifugal forces that had torn apart so many other empires. The new capital continued to grow under his watchful eye, each building rising according to carefully planned designs that would make St. Petersburg worthy of comparison with Paris or London. Italian architects worked alongside Dutch engineers and German craftsmen to create a city that would embody Peter's vision of Russia's European destiny. The broad avenues and elegant palaces that took shape along the Neva's banks represented more than mere urban planning. They were statements carved in stone about what Russia could become when freed from the constraints of its medieval past. Yet for all the grand construction projects and administrative innovations, Peter found his greatest satisfaction in the smaller, more human moments that dotted his later years. He would sometimes escape the formality of court life to visit the workshops where craftsmen laboured over the intricate details of shipbuilding or metalworking. In these places, surrounded by the honest sweat of productive labour, the emperor could briefly recapture something of the enthusiasm that had driven him as a young man learning to sail on Lake Pleshcheyevo. His relationship with Catherine deepened during these years, as if the tragedy of Alexis had taught them both the precious fragility of love and family bonds. She became not just his wife, but his closest confidant, the one person with whom he could share his fears and doubts without compromising the imperial dignity that his public role demanded. In the evenings, when the day's business was done, they would walk together through the palace gardens, speaking of their children's futures and the shape of the world they hoped to leave behind. The daughters Anna and Elizabeth grew from playful children into young women whose education reflected their father's commitment to Enlightenment principles. They learned languages and mathematics, history and natural philosophy, skills that would have been thought unnecessary or even dangerous for Russian princesses in an earlier age. Peter saw in their quick minds and curious spirits a vindication of his belief that human potential, given proper cultivation, could transcend the limitations that tradition imposed. As the 1720s progressed, Peter began to feel the weight of his years more heavily. The tremendous physical and emotional energy that had sustained him through decades of constant reform and warfare was slowly ebbing, like a tide that had reached its highest mark and now retreated toward some distant shore. His health, never robust despite his imposing physical presence, began to show the effects of a lifetime spent pushing against every limit he encountered. The urinary problems that had troubled him intermittently for years became more persistent and painful, a reminder that even emperors remained subject to the frailties of mortal flesh. The treatments available to 18th century medicine offered little relief, and Peter endured his suffering with the same stoic determination that had carried him through military campaigns and diplomatic crises. He would not allow physical discomfort to interrupt the great work that still demanded completion. During these final years, Peter's thoughts turned increasingly to questions of succession and legacy. The death of Alexis had left him without a clear male heir, a situation that threatened to plunge Russia back into the succession disputes that had plagued earlier centuries. The law of succession that he promulgated in 1722 gave the reigning monarch the right to choose his own successor, a radical departure from traditional inheritance practices that reflected both his determination to prevent civil war and his deep distrust of automatic succession based on blood relations alone. The winter of 1724 arrived in St. Petersburg with unusual severity, as if nature itself conspired to test the endurance of the city that Peter had carved from marshland and determination. Snow fell heavily on the broad avenues and classical facades that had transformed what was once Swedish wilderness into a capital worthy of the great empire it governed. In the palace windows, candlelight flickered against the early darkness of northern December, casting warm pools of illumination into rooms where the business of ruling continued despite the season's harsh embrace. Peter found himself spending more time indoors that winter, his body finally beginning to show the accumulated wear of 5 decades spent in constant motion. The emperor who had once delighted in outdoor activities, who had learned to sail in all weather and had campaigned across vast distances without complaint, now moved more slowly through palace corridors that seemed to echo with memories of more energetic days. Yet his mind remained as sharp and active as ever, turning over plans and possibilities with the same intensity that had characterized his entire reign. The administrative machinery of the empire continued to function with the efficiency that Peter had spent years creating. Reports flowed in from distant provinces, documenting the progress of reforms that would outlive their creator by generations. The naval academies were training officers who would command fleets not yet built. The manufacturing centres established under imperial patronage were producing goods that competed with imports from Western Europe. The transformation that had begun with the young Tsar's fascination with foreign tools and techniques had become a self-sustaining revolution that would reshape Russian society for centuries to come. Catherine moved through these final months with a grace that masked her own growing concern for her husband's health. She had learned to read the subtle signs of his discomfort, the slight hesitations in his step, the way his hand would sometimes press against his side when he thought no one was watching. Their conversations during this period took on a different quality, becoming less focused on immediate concerns and more reflective about the meaning of the years they had shared together. In his private study, surrounded by maps that showed the extent of Russian territory and architectural plans for buildings not yet constructed, Peter worked on his memoirs and reflected on the path that had brought him from a frightened boy hiding from the Streltsy to an emperor whose decisions affected millions of lives. The transformation seemed almost impossible to believe, even for one who had lived through every moment of it. How had that child playing with toy soldiers in Preobrazhenskoye become the man who had defeated Sweden's legendary army and founded a new capital on the Baltic shore? The answer, he realized, lay not in any single moment of decision or triumph, but in the countless small choices that had accumulated over the years, like snowflakes forming a drift. Each time he had chosen learning over tradition, action over contemplation, the difficult path over the easy one, he had moved closer to becoming the ruler Russia needed in its transition from medieval kingdom to modern empire. The process had been neither smooth nor painless, but it had been necessary. As January 1725 began, Peter's condition worsened noticeably. The urinary blockage that had troubled him intermittently became constant and agonizing, a physical manifestation of the body's rebellion against a will that had demanded too much for too long. The doctors summoned to his bedside represented the best medical knowledge available in early 18th century Europe, but their treatments proved inadequate against the emperor's deteriorating health. News of Peter's illness spread through St. Petersburg like ripples on a pond, creating an atmosphere of hushed expectation throughout the capital. Courtiers gathered in palace antechambers, speaking in whispers about succession arrangements and the future of reforms that depended so heavily on their creator's personal authority. Foreign ambassadors sent coded dispatches to their governments, reporting on the possible implications of the emperor's death for the European balance of power. Yet in the sick room where Peter lay, surrounded by the symbols of imperial power that seemed suddenly small and fragile, the focus remained remarkably intimate and human. Catherine rarely left his side, her presence a source of comfort that no medicine could provide. Their daughters visited when their father's strength permitted, bringing news of their studies and small gifts that spoke of love rather than duty. During his final conscious days, Peter's thoughts seemed to turn toward the great projects that would remain unfinished, the dreams that would require other hands to complete. He spoke to Catherine about the Academy of Sciences, about the importance of continuing to send young Russians abroad for education, about the need to maintain the naval strength that had given Russia its place among the great powers. These were not the random utterances of a dying man, but the final instructions of a ruler who understood that empires outlive emperors only when their foundations are built to last. On the morning of January the 28th, 1725, as pale winter sunlight streamed through the palace windows, Peter the Great drew his final breath. The man who had transformed Russia from a medieval kingdom into a European empire, who had created a new capital from swampland and determination, who had broken the power of tradition in favour of merit and modernization, passed quietly from a world that he had reshaped according to his extraordinary vision. The immediate silence that followed his death seemed to echo through the palace corridors and spread across the city he had built. In that moment of stillness, before the formal announcements and ceremonial responses began, those present could feel the weight of history settling upon them. An era had ended. One of the most transformative reigns in Russian history had concluded, and the empire that Peter had created would now face its first great test, the continuation of his reforms without the driving force of his personality to sustain them. In the days that followed Peter's death, as his body lay in state in the cathedral he had built, and mourners filed past to pay their respects to the emperor who had changed their world, the true scope of his achievement began to emerge like a vast landscape seen from a great height. The transformation he had wrought extended far beyond the visible monuments of St. Petersburg or the impressive statistics of military victories and territorial expansion. He had fundamentally altered the relationship between ruler and ruled, between tradition and innovation, between Russia and the wider world. The administrative system he had created continued to function even without his personal oversight, a testament to the thoroughness with which he had rebuilt the machinery of government. The table of ranks provided a framework for social mobility that would persist well into the 19th century, allowing talented individuals to rise in service to the state regardless of their birth. The military reforms that had begun with his childhood games had created an army capable of defending Russia's new status as a European power. The naval forces that had grown from his fascination with a single English boat had given Russia access to seas that had been closed to it for centuries. Yet perhaps Peter's most lasting achievement lay in the realm of possibility, the expansion of what Russians could imagine for themselves and their country. Before his reign, the idea that a Russian could study in European universities, that Russian products could compete in international markets, that Russian ideas could influence European thought, would have seemed fantastical. Peter had made these possibilities real, creating a foundation upon which future generations could build even greater achievements. The new capital itself stood as the most visible symbol of this expansion of possibility. St. Petersburg rose from the Neva marshes not merely as an alternative to Moscow, but as a statement that Russia belonged to the broader European world. The city's architecture spoke a cosmopolitan language that could be understood in Paris or Vienna, while its institutions, the Academy of Sciences, the Naval Academy, the government colleges, represented commitments to learning and rational administration that aligned with Enlightenment principles. Catherine's succession to the throne as empress in her own right marked another of Peter's revolutionary legacies. By choosing to elevate a woman of humble birth to rule the empire he had created, Peter challenged assumptions about gender, social class and political authority that had persisted for centuries. Catherine I's reign, though brief, demonstrated that effective leadership could emerge from unexpected sources when given proper support and opportunity. The educational institutions Peter had established began to bear fruit in the generation that followed his death. Young Russians who had studied abroad returned home with knowledge and perspectives that would have been impossible to acquire in the old insular Russia. They became the teachers, administrators, and innovators who would carry forward the modernization process that Peter had begun. The Academy of Sciences attracted scholars from across Europe, making St. Petersburg a center of learning that could compete with the great universities of the West. In the economic sphere, Peter's emphasis on domestic manufacturing and technological innovation had created the foundations for industrial development that would accelerate in later centuries. The ironworks and textile factories established during his reign provided both practical goods and technical expertise that reduced Russia's dependence on imports. The development of mineral resources in the Urals and Siberia opened new sources of wealth that would fund future expansion and modernization. Perhaps most importantly, Peter had demonstrated that traditional societies could transform themselves through determined leadership and systematic reform. His reign became a model studied by rulers and reformers throughout Europe and beyond, proof that seemingly immutable social and political structures could be reshaped according to rational principles and strategic vision. The concept of modernization itself, the idea that societies could consciously direct their own development toward predetermined goals, owed much to the example Peter had set. The costs of this transformation had been enormous, paid in human suffering that Peter himself had sometimes acknowledged, but never allowed to deter him from his larger purposes. The construction of St. Petersburg alone had claimed thousands of lives, workers who died in the marshes and construction sites that became the foundation for imperial grandeur. The Streltsy massacres, the execution of his own son, the forced relocations and cultural changes imposed upon reluctant populations, all of these represented the dark shadow cast by revolutionary change implemented from above. Yet for all its harshness, Peter's reign had expanded the horizons of human possibility in ways that benefited not just Russia, but the broader world. The scientific expeditions he sponsored contributed to geographic and natural knowledge that enriched European understanding of the planet they inhabited. The cultural exchanges he encouraged brought Russian perspectives into contact with Western ideas, creating new syntheses that neither tradition alone could have achieved. As the 18th century progressed and Peter's immediate successors built upon the foundations he had laid, the full dimensions of his achievement became increasingly clear. Russia had become irreversibly European in its orientation, committed to the pursuit of power and prestige through military strength, economic development, and cultural sophistication. The country that had once been dismissed by Western Europeans as backward and barbarous was now recognized as an essential player in continental politics, capable of decisive intervention in conflicts that shape the balance of power. In the end, when the chronicles have been written and the monuments have weathered countless seasons, when the details of dates and battles have faded into the comfortable distance of history, what remains is something more elemental than facts or achievements. Peter the Great had walked among his people as a force of nature made manifest in human form, a whirlwind of will and vision that had swept across the vast Russian landscape, leaving behind a transformed world that would never again be the same. The empire he built would endure for 2 more centuries, expanding across continents and shaping the destiny of nations yet unborn, when Peter drew his final breath in the palace overlooking the Neva. The reforms he implemented would evolve and adapt, but their essential spirit, the commitment to progress through rational effort, the willingness to learn from foreign examples while maintaining national identity, the belief that human society could be consciously improved through determined leadership, would persist long after the specific institutions he created had given way to new forms. In St. Petersburg, the city rises still from its marshy foundations, its classical facades and broad avenues bearing witness to one man's refusal to accept the limitations that geography and tradition had placed upon his people's destiny. The Neva flows past palaces and academies, past the fortress where his son died, and the cathedral where his own body was laid to rest, carrying with it the whispered memories of a time when giants walked the earth and reshaped it according to their dreams. The wind that blows across those northern waters carries more than the salt scent of the Baltic Sea. It bears the echo of hammers on ship hulls, of marching feet on parade grounds, of young voices reciting lessons in mathematics and navigation that would have been forbidden in an earlier age. It carries the sound of a civilization being born, not through the slow accumulation of centuries, but through the concentrated force of a single extraordinary will. Peter's true monument was never built of stone or bronze, though such memorials mark squares and parks throughout the land he ruled. His lasting achievement lived in the minds and hearts of people who had learned to imagine themselves capable of greatness, who had discovered that the seemingly impossible could be accomplished through determination and intelligent effort. He had given his people not just an empire, but an expanded sense of what it meant to be human, in a world where will and vision could triumph over circumstance and fate. The peasant children who would grow up to become admirals and architects, the merchants' daughters who would learn to read and write and think, the noble sons who would study in universities their grandfathers had never heard of, all of them lived in the shadow of what Peter had made possible. They inherited not just political institutions or economic opportunities, but a fundamental transformation in the relationship between dream and reality, between what was and what could be. In the deeper rhythms of Russian history, Peter's reign marked the moment when a nation chose its own destiny, rather than accepting what tradition and geography had seemed to decree. The choice was made not by popular vote or gradual consensus, but by the overwhelming force of a single personality who refused to accept limitations and who possessed the power to impose his vision upon an entire civilization. It was a choice that would echo through centuries, shaping not only Russia's relationship with the rest of the world, but the world's understanding of what human societies could accomplish when led by transformative leadership. As night falls over the city he created, as the lights of St. Petersburg reflect in the dark waters of the Neva, as the northern stars shine down upon the empire that stretches from Baltic shores to Pacific coasts, the spirit of Peter the Great lingers still, not as a ghost haunting familiar places, but as an enduring presence woven into the very fabric of Russian identity. The knowledge that a single human being driven by extraordinary vision and indomitable will had once lived among them and had shown them what they might become. The tide that brought his English boat to that storage shed where a young Tsar first glimpsed possibility continues to flow, carrying new dreams toward distant shores, where other giants may yet learn to walk upon the waters of their own determination. And in that eternal rhythm of tide and time, aspiration and achievement, the story of Peter the Great becomes not just history, but prophecy, a reminder that the future belongs to those bold enough to seize it, and wise enough to build foundations that will outlast their own brief passage through the world. The reign has ended, but the echo travels still through corridors of time where other dreamers wait to hear what one man's extraordinary will achieved, when wed to power and guided by an unshakable belief in human possibility. In the silence that follows great deeds, only the wind remembers, and the wind speaks still of giants. If this journey through the extraordinary life of Peter the Great has moved you, inspired you to explore the depths of history where giants once walked and empires were born from dreams made manifest, then take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Share this story with others who might find comfort in the knowledge that human determination, however seemingly impossible the obstacles, can reshape the very foundations of the world. Like this video, if it has brought you peace, if it has carried you gently towards sleep on the wings of history itself. For in sharing these timeless stories, we keep alive the memory of what humans can achieve when vision meets unwavering will, and we remind ourselves that even in our own time, giants may yet walk among us, waiting for their moment to transform the world.